We just buried Jim Morrison. I said, what? I said, what are you talking about? I said, yeah. I said, wait a minute. This is like a rumor. This is not a rumor. This is not a silly little paranoid fantasy. You mean he's dead? Yeah, he's dead. We put the coffin in the ground. The cemetery is called Père Lachaise Cemetery. It's right in Paris. Chopin is there and Molière is there. I said, I don't care who's there, man. Wait a minute. What happened? This guy's, I don't know. I don't know what happened. Yeah, I mean, was he hit by a truck or something? No. His heart stopped. His heart stopped. What are you talking about? I said, how does he look? How does he look? And this guy said, I don't know. I never saw the body. I said, hold it. What do you mean you didn't see the body? It was a sealed coffin. They buried a sealed coffin. And I said, you mean you didn't say, let me see Jim Morrison. I want to see Jim Morrison dead. You're telling me Jim Morrison is dead. Show me Jim Morrison dead. As a manager of the band, you say, that's our lead singer. That's Jim Morrison. Let me see Jim Morrison dead. Jim Morrison was never seen dead. That coffin was put in the ground, covered over, and that was it. I said, that's it? He said, that's all I know, man. I'm telling you what I know. I was here. He's dead. He's dead. Pam was all broken up. I'm telling you, Pam was just crying and weeping and everything. And, I just couldn't bring myself to open the coffin.
This is an audio recording of Doors keyboardist Ray Manzarek. Throughout this video, I'm going to share multiple interviews of him. In this first segment, the person he's describing having a conversation with is Doors manager Bill Siddons. None of Jim Morrison's bandmates knew he was dead and buried until after the fact.
We're waiting for Jim to come back. We're working on some songs. John and Robbie and I are getting together, every Tuesday and Thursday, a couple of hours in the afternoon, putting some little ditties together, working on some tunes, a little of this, a little of that, keeping the chops up, writing some songs. I had started writing some stuff. John was working on some songs himself, and we're taking this opportunity to do some wood shedding, as they call it, and work on some tunes and waiting for Jim to come back. And all of a sudden, assuming, of course, that Jim's coming back, all of a sudden Jim Morrison is not only is he not coming back, Jim Morrison is dead. Jim Morrison will never be seen again. Your buddy, your pal, your friend, your brother, your soulmate, the guy, Dionysus. I played Apollo to his Dionysus, and Apollo and Dionysus are never going to hug again.
I'd like to believe Jim was alive.
Wouldn't we all?
And I don't know, frankly. I don't really believe it. But there are some mysterious circumstances surrounding his disappearance.
Like what, for instance?
There was never an official autopsy. The French death certificate said, translated as his heart stopped. Not heart attack, but his heart stopped. Well, of course, when you die, your heart stops and your breathing stops. He died because his heart stopped. They didn't really look into his body and examine his blood or, do any kind of medical check on him. When Bill Siddons, our manager, got there, the coffin was sealed. He never saw the body. It's hard to get a cohesive story out of people in Paris who were associated with the death as to exactly what happened. And now his wife is dead. Pam, his girlfriend. His girlfriend Pam is dead. She, it's sad to say, she did OD.
Oh, no.
So we can't get the story from her, and the story that I did get from her a couple of times doesn't correspond with other people's stories as to what happened.
Did she? Did you ever ask her point blank whether she saw the body?
No. I never came. I mean, that wasn't the kind of thing you could do. She was, very tragically broken up about Jim's death, and that's why she died. For the 3 years after his death, she just walked around in a daze and crying all the time, and she really kind of flipped out and then just OD'd one day. But anyway, there are mysterious things about it. I don't know all the facts. Nobody knows how he died, what caused his death.
Amazing.
So that's why there are stories about Jim Morrison. It's very possible, it's not improbable. It's not impossible, it's improbable, that he might have sealed up the coffin and done a whole little number and split.
He might be someplace, somewhere.
He could have gone to Africa.
Jim Morrison and his longtime girlfriend Pamela Corson did spend time in Africa shortly before his death, specifically in Morocco. I'll be going over Jim's relationship with Pamela a bit later in this video. But for now, I'm going to focus on Ray Manzarek interviews. That interview you just heard of Ray discussing Jim's death was with journalist Alison Steele in 1977. It's not the only interview, however, where Ray talks about the possibility that Jim faked his death.
You know about that sealed coffin that was buried?
Listen, now you're going to say about that seal. Don't even get me started on this whole thing.
Start me up and I'll never stop.
Oh my gosh.
Well,
Really?
you know, that sealed coffin, nobody knows for sure. Some people do, I guess, but there are very few people that know whether or not Jim Morrison was actually in that coffin.
Well, yeah, it leads me to, the only person that was there was Pam, you know?
That's right.
As you just heard, Ray Manzarek himself talks about the theory that Jim Morrison may have faked his death in this interview with Susan Marie. I'll show you more from that interview a bit later. For now, this is more from Ray Manzarek's first clip, where he talks about the lead up to Jim Morrison's death.
July 3rd, 1971, Jim Morrison died in Paris under what can only be called mysterious circumstances. We don't know what happened to Jim in Paris, and I don't think we're ever going to know what happened to Jim in Paris. And the last time I saw Jim was in the recording studio when we were finishing up the album L.A. Woman. And that's actually the last time Jim Morrison was in a recording studio, the last time he ever sang, to my knowledge, on planet Earth. Certainly the last time he ever sang with the Doors. But the last recording session, the last time Jim Morrison ever sang with the Doors was that haunted little whisper voice of Riders on the Storm on the L.A. Woman album. And after he did that, he said, I'm going to Paris. I said, whoa, what a good idea, man. I thought it was an excellent idea. He said, we're close to being finished here. We've got most of the mixes done. We only got a couple more songs to mix. Everything sounds great. Why don't you guys just go ahead and finish up? And that was kind of unusual too, because Jim would always be around. He wouldn't leave. He wouldn't be there for all the mixing, but he'd certainly come in to listen to the final mixes, the final takes, and the final mix. So for Jim to actually leave before he heard the entire finished album was very unusual, and I should have realized something was up at that time. But he said, go ahead and finish it up. You get 2 or 3 songs. Everything sounds great, man. I'm leaving tomorrow for Paris. Pam's already over there. She's got a little apartment and got it all set up. She left a couple of weeks before me, and I'm going to join her over there in Paris. We said, whoa, that's interesting. Paris, huh? How long are you going to be over there? He said, I don't know. Couple of months, 6 months. I don't know. Maybe even a year. Who knows, man? I don't know. And I said, that's a good idea, dude, because we had finished our Elektra contract. We had delivered the requisite amount of recordings to Elektra Records. Our contract was concluded, and we were now a free and clear band to re-sign with Elektra if we wanted, to sign with another record company, to do whatever we wanted, or do nothing, to take a long break. And we had a little bit of money in the bank from the record sales, so we were free to do anything we wanted. So Jim was going to go to Paris. And I said, that's a great idea, actually. Get away from your drinking buddies. Get away from the bad companions and the hangers-on that were always glomming on to Jim and taking him to the bar, and Jim was always paying, and he would wine and dine these sort of ne'er-do-well friends of his, quote-unquote friends, and they were just sucking up his energy and sucking his vital essence and keeping him away from being a poet. He would sit in the bar and talk all his energy away, He wouldn't be home writing. What he should have been doing was writing instead of talking it out and staggering in way past the midnight hour, far too late. And Pam was always mad at him because he was always running around and getting drunk with his friends. And so Pam and Jim had a stormy relationship. And I think to make things up with her, he was going to go to Paris with her. Why they had picked Paris, I have no idea. But I thought, that's great. Paris is great because that's the city of light, the city of artists, an American in Paris. Just get away from all of this LA stuff and this whole rock and roll thing and become a poet again. Become the guy that I knew back in Venice, the guy that I knew in film school at UCLA, the writer, the artist, energized young man that I knew back in Venice. And I thought, this is going to be great. Go to Paris and do it, man. Start to write again. Start to become an artist. Just be an artist again. Don't be a rock star. Be an artist. And off he went, and he said, I'll see you, brother. And I said, okay, man, just stay in touch, and we'll talk to you in a while. He went off to Paris, and, we didn't hear anything from Jim one way or the other for about a month and a half, 2 months. Record had come out. L.A. Woman was doing great. People say, the Doors are back. The critics said, the Doors are back with their intensity and power once again, and critics loved it, and sales were doing very nicely. And Lover Madly was a hit single, so you had a hit single on an album that had some great long songs, Riders on the Storm and L.A. Woman and like that. And Jim called John Densmore and asked John how the record's doing. And John said, oh, man, it's doing great. You know, it's racing up the charts and people love it. And Jim said, oh, it's terrific, man. He said, man, as soon as I get back, we got to go on the road. I want to play those songs live, you know. I mean, we never got to play those songs live. John said to him, exactly, man. Boy, I'd love to play L.A. Woman and Riders on the Storm. We could take a bass player with us. And Jim said, yeah, why don't we take that guy that played with us, that Jerry Sheff guy, man. We'll take him on the road with us. And John said, yeah, that's a great, we'll take him. Maybe we'll take the guitar player. Maybe not. Maybe we'll get some other guitar player. At least take the bass player along. And Morrison said, boy, I can't wait to play those songs. As soon as I get back, man, let's book a little tour. What do you say? And John said, okay, man, when are you coming back? And Jim said, I don't know. You know, I'm having a pretty good time. And, you know, I'll be here for a while yet. And John said, okay, man, well, you know, next time I talk to you, you know, stay cool, man. Enjoy yourself. And that was like in the early June. That was early June. And then by July 3rd, that was it, man. I got a phone call telling me that Jim Morrison is dead. A phone call from this guy that was our manager. And he called and said, I just got a phone call from Paris saying that Jim Morrison is dead. And I said, get out of here. I don't believe it, man, Jim Morrison. Jim Morrison said, Paul is dead. There was a lot of, everybody's dead at that time. Paul is dead because he was walking across the street on the Beatles album, Abbey Road, and he was walking out of step and he didn't have shoes on. And in Italy, if you don't have shoes on, that means you're a corpse. You had a suit but no shoes. That's how they bury a corpse. And see, he's out of step with the other three guys, that means he's dead. You know, people were starting to get a little death obsessed. Manson had happened, and, you know, the whole thing was getting a little weird. You know, obviously the Kennedys were dead and Martin Luther King was dead. You know, this planet was filled with ghosts of dead young soldiers and Vietnamese women and children and Vietnamese soldiers. So it was starting to get a little spooky on planet Earth. So, you know, I said, I don't believe it, man. It's just death rumors, you know. Because Jim, here's a funny story. We were at a party, you know, and Jim was supposed to be at the party, didn't come, was a little late coming to the party. Somebody runs in and says, Jim Morrison's just been killed in an automobile accident. 5 minutes later, Jim walks in the door. We said, Jim, man, I thought you were dead. He said, no. Rumors of my death have been greatly exaggerated. You know, always quoting somebody, a Mark Twain quote. And I said, you know. And then it was another time he had fallen out of a window and he was supposed to be dead. So when I heard the story that Jim Morrison was dead, I said, it's ridiculous, man. It's just more of that paranoid death stuff. And this guy said, no, this time I think it's serious. And I said, well, you know, I'm certainly not going to Paris to check out some silly rumor, you know. And he said, don't worry, I've got a 12 o'clock flight. This is like 8 o'clock in the morning. So I got the 12 o'clock flight to Paris. I'm going over there. And okay, fine. Well, find out this time, will you, man? I mean, and I said to him, just make sure this time, will you? 3-4 days later, I get a phone call. This guy says to me, we just buried Jim Morrison. This is like on a Friday or Saturday. It was Friday, I think. Maybe it was Saturday. I forget, Friday or Saturday. Monday, it was either Monday or Tuesday morning. We just buried Jim Morrison.
Now, switching gears to the beginning of The Doors, this is an interview Ray Manzarek did with NPR, in which he talks about how The Doors started. For context, Jim Morrison and Ray Manzarek both went to UCLA Film School in Los Angeles. They met at film school in January of 1964. Although Ray was a graduate student and Jim was an undergrad, they were both classmates. The film department was small, so sometimes graduate and undergraduate students took the same classes. In any case, they both graduated film school at the exact same time, in August of 1965. Ray earning his graduate degree, Jim earning his undergraduate.
After we said our goodbyes, after graduation, I'm sitting on the beach wondering what I'm going to do with myself. Who comes walking down the beach but James Douglas Morrison? Looking great. Lost 30 pounds. Was down to about 135, 6 feet tall. Michelangelo's David. He had the ringlets and curly hair starting to kind of fall over his ears. He looks just great. And I said, Jim, come on over here, man. And I said, well, what have you been up to? So what's going on? And he said, well, I've been living up on Dennis Jacobs' rooftop. and writing songs. And I said, whoa, writing songs. Okay, man, cool. Like, sing me a song. And he said, oh, I'm kind of shy, because I knew he was a poet. He knew I was a musician. So he sat down on the beach, dug his hands into the sand, and the sand started streaming out in little rivulets, and he kind of closed his eyes, and he began to sing in a Chet Baker haunted whisper kind of voice. He began to sing Moonlight Drive, and when I heard that first stanza, let's swim to the moon, let's climb through the tide, penetrate the evening that the city sleeps to hide, I thought, ooh, spooky and cool, man. I can do all kinds of stuff behind that. I could do my Ray Charles and my and my Muddy Waters, Otis Spann influences, and I could do just all kinds of bluesy, funky stuff behind what Jim was singing. And then he had a couple of other songs, My Eyes Have Seen You and Summer's Almost Gone, and they had beautiful melodies to them that would just allow for chord changes and improvisations. And I said, man, this is incredible. Let's get a rock and roll band together. And he said, that's exactly what I want to do. And I said, all right, man. But one thing, what do we call the band? It's got no name. We can't call it Morrison and Manzarek. I mean, or Eminem, or, two guys from Venice Beach or something. He said, no, man, we're going to call it The Doors. And I said, what? That's ridiculous. The Door. Oh, wait a minute. You mean like the doors of perception, the doors in your mind? And I said, that's it, the doors of perception. He said, no, just the Doors. I said, like Aldous Huxley. He said, yeah, but we're just the Doors. And that was it. We were the Doors. And that's how the band got formed.
You still needed other musicians.
Yep.
So you ended up finding the drummer, John Densmore, and guitarist, Robbie Krieger. But you became not only the keyboard player, but the bass player, too.
That was of necessity.
Tell us that story.
We had the four of us, but we didn't have a bass player. So I applied my boogie-woogie background, my rock and roll boogie-woogie. It was very easy for me to, once we found the Fender Rhodes keyboard bass, 32 notes of extra low sounding low notes, it was very easy for me to do. That was the whole thing. And you just keep that left hand going. You don't do anything with it. It just goes and goes. And that's what I did. I just over and over repetitive bass lines that are just like boogie woogie. It just keeps on going. That's why Lefty here is, thank you. He did a very good job. He's not too quick. Bit of a slow-witted fellow, Lefty, but he's really strong and solid and plays what he has to play. So Lefty became our bass player.
One of the really big stories in the lore of The Doors is the concert in Miami.
Yes, it is.
Where many people say that Jim Morrison exposed himself.
Yes, they do.
In this next part, Ray talks about the infamous Miami incident from March of 1969, in which Jim allegedly pulled out his private on stage.
We're in Miami. It's hot and sweaty. It's a Tennessee Williams night. It's a swamp, and it's a horrible kind of place, a seaplane hangar, and 14,000 people are packed in there, and they're sweaty, and this is the first time he's been home. He was born in Melbourne, Florida. This is virtually his hometown, and he's going to show these Florida people what psychedelic West Coast shamanism and confrontation is all about. He takes his shirt off in the middle of the set and says, you people haven't come to hear a rock and roll. He's drunk as a skunk, and he didn't tell any of us what he was going to do, if only he'd have told somebody. He said, you didn't come to hear a rock and roll band play some pretty good songs. You came to see something, didn't you? And they're all going, yeah. He said, what'd you come to see? You came to see something that you've never seen before, something greater than you've ever seen. What do you want? What can I do for you? And the audience is going like this, That's how the audience is just rumbling and rumbling. And he said, okay, how about if I show you my... And all the audience goes screaming crazy. It was like madness. And Jim takes his shirt off, holds it in front of him, reaches behind it, and starts fiddling around down there. And you wonder, what is he doing? He's going to take it off. And the audience is getting crazier and crazier. And then Jim whips the shirt out to the side. He says, did you see it? Did you see it? Look, I just showed it to you. Watch, I'm going to show it to you. Now keep your eyes on it, folks. And he whips it out, off to the side again. Off to the side, and says, I showed it to you. You saw it, didn't you? You saw it, and you loved it, and you people loved seeing it. Isn't that what you wanted to see? And sure enough, it's what they wanted to see. They hallucinated. I swear the guy never did it. He never whipped it out. It was one of those mass hallucinations.
And then you say, he said to the audience, come closer, come on down here.
Oh, yeah.
Get
Come on,
with
yeah,
us,
of course.
man.
Sure, come on, join us on stage. And eventually they started coming on a rickety little stage, and the entire stage collapsed, sure.
What were you thinking?
It's chaos. It's the end of the world as we know it. It's rock and roll. It's madness. It's the end of Western civilization. John and Robbie left the stage, and I just played screaming, crunching, organ all over the place, just the way I did when my first piano lesson.
Was there a part of you that was saying, my stupid buddy Jim Morrison is creating this madness? We'll be lucky if we get off the stage alive.
There was a part of me that was saying, we're going to get in big trouble. We're in trouble here. But you know what? It's too late to stop it. So why not treat it as a theatrical event, But we're going to get in serious trouble. And sure enough, within a week, Jim had been arrested. He had been charged with indecent exposure, public profanity, open profanity, public drunkenness, lewd and lascivious behavior. And they read this in court. He did take his penis out and shake it. And once they read that in court, I knew it was a total fiasco because he had never done it. He didn't do it.
In this part, he discusses how the Doors wrote songs, specifically Light My Fire.
Why don't we look at Light My Fire, which
Sure.
is probably the most famous, or one of the most famous
song. Yeah,
sure.
The most famous Doors song. It's that worldwide popular appeal, most famous. And Robbie Krieger is actually the writer of Light My Fire. So the way we would work on songs is somebody would bring a song in, and then everyone would go to work on it. It'd be like little bees, or little things spinning and working and weaving. So Robbie came in with a song. He said, I got a new song called Light My Fire. The first song Robbie Krieger ever wrote. What a genius he is. He's just the greatest guy. Great guitar player and great songwriter. I've got a song called Light My Fire. So he plays the song for us. And it's kind of a Sonny and Cher kind of dun, da, dun, 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 Light My Fire. And it's like, okay. Good chord change. What are the chord changes there? And he shows me an A minor to an F sharp minor. And that's like, whoa, that's hip. That's cool. Densmore says, look, we got to do a Latin kind of beat here. Let's do something in kind of a Latin groove. So John's doing ka-chinka, chinka, dunga. And we set up this Latin groove and then go into a hard rock 4. And Robbie's only got a one verse. He needs the second verse. And Morrison says, okay, let me think about it for a second. And Jim comes up with the classic line, and our love becomes a funeral pyre. You know that it would be untrue. You know that I would be a liar if I were to say to you, girl, we couldn't get much higher as Robbie's. Then Jim comes, the time to hesitate is through. In other words, seize the moment. No time to wallow in the mire. Try now. We can only lose. Whoa, that's kind of heavy. Try now, we can only lose, meaning the worst thing that can happen to you is death. And our love becomes a funeral pyre. Jim, what a great verse, man. So we've got verse, chorus, and then it's time for solos. Here's where John Coltrane comes in. Here's where the Doors jazz background. John's a jazz drummer. I'm a jazz piano player. Robbie's a flamenco guitar player. And we all said, we're in A minor. Let's see. What do we do? Dun, 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 dun. It ends up on an E. So how about My Favorite Things? John Coltrane. It's My Favorite Things, except Coltrane's doing it in D minor. But the left hand is exactly the same thing. And that's how Light My Fire came about.
What we set out to do is to get right in between the Beatles and the Rolling Stones.
That's amazing.
Yeah, the Beatles were nice pseudo country and western harmony, something like the Everly Brothers. There were two guys from the 50s called the Everly Brothers. Great harmony, and the Beatles had that same kind of great harmony and great kind of poppy kind of songs, really good songs. And then the Rolling Stones were the blues guys.
Right.
So we were the psychedelic band. We were going to be right in between, combining the blues but we were going to throw in some jazz and some flamenco, and that's what we did. We knew we were good, I did. I knew from the get-go that this is exciting music, and is it fun to play? It was great to play with Jim and John and Robbie. They played flamenco guitar with his fingers. He played rock and roll with like a flamenco guitar player.
Oh my goodness!
And John Densmore was the lead drummer, snare drum man in the high school marching band. That's the sound of the Doors. It's everybody bringing something from a totally different place. And that all took place on the beach in Venice, California, back in 65. Started in summer of 65.
65.
On the beach, and we started talking about life, and he sang me Moonlight Drive. And those were the first lyrics I ever heard. Let's swim to the moon. Let's climb through the tide. Penetrate the evening that the city sleeps to hide. And I said, wow, that's cool, man. I can play all kinds of great stuff behind that.
I want to talk a little bit about UCLA, because in 64, over there at the film school, you produced 5 films, and that's also where you met Dorothy?
Met my wife. Jim Morrison.
Yeah, and met
UCLA.
Jim, yeah. I mean, you wanted to be a filmmaker?
Yeah, well, that's why we're there. But unfortunately, UCLA at the time was very artistic and was teaching us how to make movies like Europeans, like the French, Fellini from Italy, and amazing films. And so we learned all that stuff that was going on, and that had nothing to do with Hollywood, unfortunately. Hollywood was making Doris Day movies. Doris Day and Rock Hudson and Pillow Talk.
Oh,
that was what they were doing. Or, big spectacles, great beyond belief spectacles. And we were all trying to make personal, small films, and they didn't want that. So, Jim and I decided to form a rock and roll band because we saw the Beatles on TV, saw the Rolling Stones. And it was like, hey, look at those guys, man.
I wanted to ask you about Oliver Stone's depiction of all of you guys in the Doors, on film. Was that accurate to what actually occurred?
Yes. And Jim Morrison was drinking. He was drinking. He drank too much. And he died.
Right.
That's what you get for drinking too much. And God knows what else he was doing.
Yeah. A lot of the world, they see Morrison, they see Jim, as they say, the rock idol and all this crazy. I see him as a poet and like a theatrical kind of performer, but mostly a poet. If someone asked me about Jim, I'd say he was a poet. And I didn't know, how did you view?
Well, that's why we put the band together in the first place. We were going to combine poetry and rock and roll.
Right.
When he sang Moonlight Drive to me, I realized he had great poetry. Then he did another song. We're just sitting on the beach in Venice, sunset, and middle of summer. And then he did My Eyes Have Seen You.
Yeah.
Just that concept alone of your eyes actually looking. We never think about that. But he says, my eyes have seen you. Let them photograph your soul. Memorize your alleys on an endless roll of film. And then there was Summer's Almost Gone. Where will we be when the summer's gone? So, they were all very poetic lyrics, and I could play all kinds of great music behind it. And all we needed was a guitar player and a drummer, and then we found John and Robbie, and bada boom, there were the Doors. Poetry and rock and roll, and in rock and roll you can play anything. It wasn't just we were going to play rock, jazz, blues, classical, flamenco.
I was looking at some of your influences while living in Chicago. Are Thelonious Monk and like John Coltrane are some of them. Now, has that helped you to shape you as a musician, but more so with your keyboard work?
Well, I was also influenced by the blues guys. Those are jazz guys. Thelonious Monk played jazz. John Coltrane's jazz sax player. Monk is a jazz keyboard player. Miles Davis and his cool modal sound was very important to me. We incorporated a lot of that into the Doors. And then on the other side were the blues guys, Muddy Waters and Howlin' Wolf and John Lee Hooker and all those great blues players. So
stuff.
The Doors combine a blues and a jazz sound with a classical. Light My Fire is like a classical Bach kind of, I studied a little Bach, studied some classical. And so it's all in there, with Robbie's flamenco guitar and his bottleneck guitar.
Exactly.
So, my organ, Robbie's bottleneck guitar, John's good hard drumming, and Jim Morrison's Southern Gothic poetry.
Yeah, very much so. And see, it created just something very eclectic. Regarding Light My Fire, I was looking, and in the past, correct me if I'm wrong, you used a Fender Rhodes piano, a Vox Continental organ, and a Gibson G10 Kalamazoo?
I played a Vox Continental organ as played by all the English mod bands. Eric Burden and the Animals, Alan Price played the Vox Continental, the Dave Clark Five. Anybody who played an organ had a Vox Continental. I was lucky enough to get a Vox Continental. Now, on top of that, I played the Fender Rhodes keyboard bass. It had like 32 notes, and it sat on the left-hand side above. It sat on top of the organ. It was a thin, flat organ. So I had, as it's called, two manuals. The right hand for all the lead lines, and on the left-hand side, I played the bass notes. It was like playing like boogie woogie.
Well, that's how I could picture you playing. You always had your one hand out like this. You were always playing. I could picture that. The Gibson G10 Kalamazoo?
Yeah. Then later on, the Vox Continental fell apart, and it was no longer made by England. English people sold Vox to some foreign country, and they started making a cheesy instrument. Not that it wasn't cheesy to begin with, but it was really bad and started falling apart. So at that point, I switched over to the Gibson Kalamazoo.
Gotcha.
But I never played a Farfisa.
I was looking at that. I said a Farfisa. You're going to have to explain. What is a Farfisa?
Well, it's something I never played, so I have no idea.
Now, did you coordinate all three of those sounds to make the sound that I would say that crossed over as the sound of the Doors, like what we just heard in Light My Fire?
Well, it's a keyboard, it's a keyboard band. I mean, there were three musicians, a drummer, a guitar player, and a guy playing keyboards, playing both bass and lead lines and chords at the same time. So I guess it was. I met Michael Jackson and Paul McCartney when they were recording that, whatever the song, The Girl Is Mine, She's Mine, No, She's Mine, She's Mine, Michael, No, Paul, She's Mine. Whatever album that was from. I think it was Thriller, and they were both there. And Michael Jackson, he was still an incredibly handsome young man. I don't know how old he was, early 20s, and just handsome as all get out, and just so young and vulnerable, and just such a good-looking guy, and was just really handsome and just charming and delightful. I'm going to get back on Facebook. I got a text. Leave me alone. I'm texting.
It's true. Isn't that scary?
I'm
Twittering. It's the world of technology.
Twittering my life away. Boy, there's a lot of distractions,
Yes, there is.
A lot of distractions.
As mentioned earlier, now I'm going to take a look at Jim's relationship with Pamela Courson and more. This is some of the only known footage of Pamela Courson. I've included all the other known footage of her in this video as well. Pamela and Jim Morrison had one of the most tumultuous relationships in music history. They dated on and off from 1965 until 1971, right up until the night of Jim Morrison's death in their apartment in Paris on July 3rd, 1971. She herself died about 3 years later on April 25th, 1974, from an accidental heroin overdose. The official cause of death for Jim Morrison is heart failure, though many people dispute this, especially since there was no autopsy. Later in this video, I'll be touching on that. I'm going to be giving a very detailed history of the last few days of Jim Morrison's life. In particular, I'm going to go over the last few hours of his life and the immediate aftermath following his death. Now, it's not clear who took all the different footage of Pamela that exists, but this footage in particular of Pamela in a cemetery was taken by Jim Morrison himself. This footage was taken in mid-May of 1971, about a month and a half before Jim died. In mid-May, Jim and Pamela took a 10-day trip to Corsica, France's biggest island. And on one of those days, they visited this cemetery. It's the cemetery of the Saint-Florent region of Corsica, locally known as the Cimetière de Saint-Florent. If you go on Google Maps, you'll see that the cemetery is located literally right across the street from the Mediterranean Sea. Jim Morrison took the footage of Pamela here on a Super 8mm camera. Before the invention of videotape and eventually digital cameras, smartphones, etc., Super 8mm cameras were used by lots of people. It was a popular consumer product. These cameras were first manufactured in 1965, the same year Jim Morrison graduated from film school. Jim Morrison's UCLA film connections don't end with Ray Manzarek. Francis Ford Coppola, one of the greatest film directors ever, the man who directed the Godfather films, Apocalypse Now, and more, posted the following on his Instagram on January 6, 2024. I was friends with Jim Morrison when we were film students at UCLA. He was a very warm and kind person, very considerate, interesting, and had a strong interest in philosophy. His father made a big impression on him. He was a naval admiral, commander of an aircraft carrier. One night, they, the Doors, brought me their record, and I listened to Light My Fire. 2 years later, they were a big deal. On the set of Apocalypse Now, one of my editors, Barry Malkin, was set to go home on a Saturday. I was still shooting, and I visited the editing room before he left. I saw a bin that was filled with the Doors songs and noticed one with the title The End, and jokingly said, "Wouldn't it be interesting if we started the beginning of the movie with a song called The End?" I then reached into the bin of what was supposed to be scrap footage and just pulled out anything. It turned out to be some film showing helicopters sliding by the flames of the big napalm drop in the Battle of the Valkyries scene. And I liked it, so I made it the beginning. End quote. Apocalypse Now was released in the United States on August 15, 1979, a little over 8 years after Jim's death on July 3rd of 71. In February of 71, about 5 months before his death, Jim said that he's always wanted to make films, arguably more than being in a band. He said that to journalist Ben Fong Torres, and in a few minutes I will play you the actual audio of Jim saying this in the interview. In that interview, Jim talks about 2 films in particular, Feast of Friends and Highway. Feast of Friends is a documentary about the Doors' 1968 summer tour. It was directed by Paul Ferreira, a friend of Jim's. There's actually 2 versions of the film. There's the original 50-minute version, which was released in 1969, and then there's the 2014 remaster, which is 144 minutes long, almost 2.5 hours. The original version had its premiere at the New York Film Festival on September 29th of 69. Despite the fact the film has generally been well received over the years, Jim talks about in his interview with Ben Fong Torres how Feast of Friends was actually booed at the San Francisco Film Festival in 1969. The 2 of them muse over how perhaps that's why the festival rejected Jim's next film, Highway. Unlike Feast of Friends, Jim actually directed Highway, at least partially. He was one of 4 directors on that project. The full name of the movie is Highway, an American Pastoral. It's a 52-minute experimental film which Jim himself described as quote-unquote a warm-up for something bigger. It was filmed in Southern California during the spring and summer of 1969. The film doesn't have too much of a narrative, but essentially, without revealing too much, Jim Morrison plays the role of a hitchhiker who makes his way from the Mojave Desert to Los Angeles. The film only had one big public screening before Jim died. That screening took place at the Jim Morrison Film Festival. Yes, you heard that correctly, the Jim Morrison Film Festival. It was a one-time event which took place on March 27, 1970 in Vancouver, Canada. In addition to Highway, the festival also featured various other Doors-related films, including Feast of Friends. The festival was organized by a now-defunct music magazine from Vancouver called Poppin' Magazine. Now, one of the first known films Jim ever made is titled First Love. It's a short film Jim made while he was a student at the University of California, Los Angeles, UCLA. The following is from Far Out magazine. Quote, First Love remains the only one of Jim Morrison's films from UCLA that have survived to the present day. The 1964 short film was inspired by his friend Max Schwartz and Schwartz's girlfriend at the time, Liz, who were going through a rough patch during the filming. Schwartz claims that Liz was the first person that Morrison ever did LSD with. The film is a black and white art picture that has no sound. It mainly features Liz walking around campus and Schwartz attempting to take pictures of her. It feels very much like a film made by a young college student, but it has a certain charm in its lack of sophistication. End quote. Now, as mentioned earlier, I will play some of the audio from the February 1971 Ben Fong Torres interview in which Jim Morrison discusses his love for filmmaking, his thoughts on the future of filmmaking and media, and where he sees himself in 5 months from now. Tragically and ironically, it was about 5 months from this interview when he died.
I guess that's what I've always really wanted to do, even more than being in a band, was to work in films.
When we talk about films, are you saying strictly films as relating to cinema houses, or are you thinking about video cassettes and that sort of thing too?
No, if I made a film, I would be making it for a movie house because, I'm sure cassettes will, when you think about it, they've probably already replaced television even though they haven't been marketed yet. Mm-hmm. I mean, once the idea is there, it's already happened, But I think people will always have a desire to huddle together in a dark theater and be an audience and react to something as an audience, which you can't do. Because a cassette will be more like watching TV or listening to an album or reading a book. Mm-hmm. But I would be making a film for movie audience, movie houses as we know them.
Which would then be used for cassettes anyway.
Sure. But I think, although movie houses are probably already an anachronism, mm-hmm. I can't think of anything else because I've never just seen a cassette. I like the idea of it, but
Yeah. Well, of course, the limitations are the size and the cost, and the fact that there aren't probably that many films that you would pay as the main time as a director.
But economically, to make a film for a movie house would be, now with the advent of cheaper production methods, 16 millimeter and all that,
Yeah.
it would be, you'd probably make a film now for a movie house the same as you would if you were making it directly for a video cassette.
Mm.
I don't think the economic factor would be that much different,
Mm-hmm.
or the production methods.
Yeah.
And I'd like to write and direct a film of my own. You know, I have a film I made. Maybe you ought to see it sometime.
Would you see some?
It's called Highway, HWY.
You know, I heard about it, yeah. That was included in, what's included in that festival of films of yours up in Canada?
Right.
Uh-huh. How did it go over?
The reports I got back was that Highway was very enthusiastically received. It's a 50-minute film. It's 35 millimeter and some color.
Yeah. Is it more of you and the group, or
No,
something totally different?
it's a fiction thing. I act in it and I made it with some friends of mine. But I don't think it has much commercial appeal. I would like people to see it, though. It was more of an exercise for me, kind of a warm-up for something bigger. It's more poetic, you know, and it's not, there's no story or anything, essentially. Highway was entered in the San Francisco Film Festival, but it was rejected for whatever reason, I don't know. Feast of Friends was a year or so ago. It met with a lot of boos. I think they were probably reacting to personalities rather than a film, because it was a film. The film Feast of Friends was a poetic documentary. All that was a crew, a small crew, following us around for about a year, and then we cut a film out of it. So that was a true poetic documentary of where it was at that time.
So you're really enjoying that kind of
Right.
thing at that time?
It was still fun at that time.
You were saying that you might not do concerts until after a couple of albums, or may not even do any concerts at all. When did it stop getting to be fun? Were you just bored with it, or did you sense something in the audience that...
I think there's a certain moment when you're right in time with your audience, and then you both grow out of it, and you just have to realize that it's not that you've outgrown the audience, it's just that it has to go on to something else. But you see, when you have a record contract, and unfortunately when you're first starting out, you can't just sign up for a couple of records. Usually contracts are like 5 or 6 records. We had 6 records, and so there's a pressure on you to keep putting them out because you have to fulfill this obligation.
Yeah.
I mean, there are ways to get out of it, but that means the death of the group, you know. You have to reform and go somewhere else under a new name or something.
How much longer do you have with Electric?
Well, we're at work on our last album for them.
Do you see far beyond that?
I can't see too much beyond that. You know, it's a day-to-day thing. I think we're at this album, we're at kind of a crossroads in our career.
Yeah.
And so, you know, we'll know within the next 5 or 6 months what the future will be.
What about Robbie and John? Would they want to stay with later?
It's really no beef with the label at all.
Yeah.
Because I'm sure as record companies go, I've never been on another one, but I'm sure they're just as good as any other one. It's not, you know, it's not a quarrel with them.
Right. No, it's just more like yourselves where you stand.
So what this album will be is kind of, it's not a return to anything or falling back into some older kind of music. It's mainly thinking about what we enjoy and not worrying about the result of it so much.
Was there anybody who influenced you in making that decision musically?
Not really. It just, I guess when the audience became something amorphous and, you know, a couple years ago we had a close contact with an audience because we play, you know, 200 days out of the year, something like that.
Yeah.
And now that we don't, the audience is something, it's an unknown quantity. We have no contact with it. So we have to fall back on ourselves.
Jim Morrison is without question one of the most iconic musicians in the history of rock and roll, partly because of his death at the age of 27. The American poet, ironically, did not die in America. He passed away overseas in France on July 3rd, 1971. The question is, why was he in France? Or rather, why wasn't he in America? Jim Morrison arrived in France with his longtime on-again, off-again girlfriend Pamela Courson in March of 1971. At the time, Jim was facing serious legal issues stemming from his infamous performance with The Doors in Miami in 1969, when he allegedly exposed himself during the concert. His future with The Doors was also clouded in uncertainty at this point, and the rock and roll party lifestyle of Los Angeles was starting to get to him. Looking to get away from it all and to clear his mind, Jim left for France with Pamela. Unfortunately, this trip had the opposite of its intended effect. Jim would soon find himself drinking away and taking drugs as per usual. Now, one drug Jim is said to have been opposed to is heroin. Despite this, it's been suggested by many that heroin is ultimately what killed Jim Morrison in Paris. Early in the morning on July 3, 1971, Jim Morrison died in the bathtub of the Paris apartment he was sharing with Pamela Courson. Officially, his cause of death was listed as heart failure. However, no autopsy was performed, and so to this day, no one definitively knows what exactly killed Jim Morrison. As mentioned though, there are many people who believe that it was heroin which took him in. It's believed by some that Jim Morrison may have taken heroin that night, mistaking it for cocaine. In any case, bottom line, Jim Morrison was found dead the morning of July 3, 1971, at the age of 27. The question is, where would the heroin have come from? Pamela is known to have taken heroin, and it's been suggested that the heroin Jim may have mistaken for cocaine would have been Pamela's. Sadly, Pamela Courson herself died from a heroin overdose on April 25, 1974, also at the age of 27. I'm going to read to you a part from Stephen Davis's book, Jim Morrison, Life, Death, Legend. Here, he discusses the last days of Jim Morrison's life. He looks into the details of Jim Morrison's final days in Paris, his time in France as a whole, some of the crazy things which happened to Jim, and ultimately, Jim Morrison's death and the aftermath. Quote, "She was known among a certain louche element of the Parisienne jeunesse dorée as Pamela Morrison, wife of the famous American rock star. With her cool California beauty, fashion-forward wardrobe, long straight hair, paid-up credit cards, and ready laugh, Pamela was now a familiar figure in upscale Saint-Germain hangouts like Café de Fleurs, Les Deux Magots, and Brasserie Lippe as a companion of the young, well-connected Count Jean de Breteuil. Through Jean, Pamela had become friends with the gamine model and starlet Elisabeth Larivière, known professionally as Zozo. Zozo lived in a large apartment on the right bank, and when Pam learned that Zozo had a job coming up in the south, she arranged for Jim to rent the flat while Zozo was away that spring. Sometime in the middle of March 1971, Jim moved into the second largest bedroom of a fourth-floor apartment in a handsome 19th century Beaux-Arts building at 17 Rue Bois-Trellis in the 4th arrondissement. The large, slightly shabby flat was furnished with the typically overstuffed antiques of the bourgeoisie. There were elegant marble fireplaces, parquet floors, plaster reliefs on the walls, and the ceiling of the salon was painted with a blue sky and puffy clouds. The leaky bathroom, smelling of old-fashioned French plumbing, had a bidet, a toilet, and a narrow-tiled wall tube that was equipped with a handheld shower. Zozo had padlocked her bedroom while she was away. Jim's room faced the morning sun, and he moved a leather-covered writing table by the big window. As the day progressed, he would move the table to the other side of the flat so he could sit in the sun as it warmed the courtyard in the rear of the building. A concert pianist lived across the courtyard, and the sound of her daily exercises seemed to please Jim. On the apartment's lobby mailbox, he taped a handwritten label for the postman, James Douglas, one of his incognito names. Judging from the entries in surviving notebooks, Jim began to explore Paris immediately. He visited his friend Agnes Varda at her apartment at 84 Rue Daguerre. Jim played with her daughter Rosalie a bit. Mostly, he just sat with Agnes and a few of her friends in her garden. Varda later told German journalist Rainer Modermann, quote, "Jim didn't say a superfluous word. He didn't like gossip. We used to meet relatively often, but I cannot say we ever talked much. We respected him. His greatest wish when he came to Paris was to remain here incognito as someone who just wanted to write his poems." End quote. Jim also told Varda that he had both his films with him and that he wanted to set up some screenings for them in Paris. Varda told Jim this might take some time in the present anti-American political climate in France, but that she would see what she could do. Pamela later told Jim that she didn't like Varda. Jim replied that if anything ever went wrong, Varda would be the only person in Paris that Pamela could completely trust. At first, Jim made notes on his wanderings through the Marais, the old quarter of Paris in which he lived. During the Renaissance, it had been the most elegant part of Paris, but had since become a funky and bohemian neighborhood dotted by stupendous landmarks of its past grandeur. Jim was drawn to the busy cafes around the Place de la Bastille. A Parisian friend of Pamela's, Victor Lamy, who would sometimes walk with Jim, recalls that he would emerge from his building in the early afternoon and walk to the boulevard to buy the International Herald Tribune. Then he liked to walk back up the Rue Beautreillis, past the repertory Théâtre Espace Marais, where Beaumarchais' Le Mariage de Figaro was playing, and continue past the large and cheerful elementary school L'École Massillon until he reached the Seine. His favorite route took Jim across the Pont Marie and along the Île Saint-Louis, the exclusive island in the middle of the river. Spring had arrived early in Paris that year, and on sunny days, Jim would often sit at one of the outside tables of the brasserie at the head of the Rue Saint-Louis en Île and drink a beer or two, either Stella Artois or Kronenberg. Refreshed, Jim pressed on across the footbridge to the Île de la Cité, where he sometimes paused to light a candle in one of the quiet chapels of the Notre Dame Cathedral. Victor Lemy remembers that Jim was very attentive to the street musicians. There was music everywhere in Paris. American kids strumming guitars in the Place Saint-Michel, European kids bowing violins, English and Irish buskers, gypsies playing accordions in the metro. Jim usually emptied his pockets for these scruffy musicians, Lemy said, and he stopped to listen to almost everyone he saw. And he gave each one a few francs or a large roll of bills if that was all he had with him. Another thing was that he wasn't recognized. He had this freedom, a different thing for him. He wore a suede jacket, a nice dress shirt, corduroy trousers. He looked like any postgraduate American 27-year-old student at the Sorbonne. Jim then crossed to the left bank. Sometimes he kept walking along the river, browsing in the bookstalls. Other times he wandered through the Sorbonne, the University of Paris, and paused amid the many bookshops. Paris was still in the grip of the revolutionary events of 1968, and Jim often stopped to watch, with total fascination, student demonstrations turn into mini riots in the streets. The government was paving over much of the Latin Quarter because the demonstrators of '68 had ripped up the city's classic old cobblestones and thrown them at the riot police. In 1971, Jim Morrison saw the last of the old Paris streets before they were lost forever. Sometimes Jim Morrison stopped for a drink at Pamela's hangout, the Café de Flore, erstwhile haunt of existentialist heroes Sartre and de Beauvoir, and sometimes at the Deux Moigots, where Hemingway and Scott Fitzgerald contemplated the facade of the Saint-Germain-des-Prés, the oldest church in Paris. Jim always had a spiral notebook or a bound journal with him and often seemed lost in their pages. Several times that spring, Jim was recognized and photographed, once smoking a cigar by young American tourists. Jim then usually recrossed the Seine on the Point des Arts, caught the number 1 metro at the Louvre, got out at the St. Paul station, and walked home along the Rue Saint-Antoine, sometimes shopping for a bottle of whiskey, a bag of fresh strawberries, or a 10-cent fresh baguette. When the weather was fine and he didn't feel like walking, Jim often hung out at the exquisite Place des Vosges 2 blocks from his room. This 17th century square of red brick mansions was usually full of children and their nursemaids, and Jim liked to sit for hours and write or just watch the children playing in the sandboxes. It was one of the most historic places in France, the site of medieval jousts, royal palaces, and Renaissance military parades. Victor Hugo's house was in one corner of the square at number 6. Number 8 had been the home of Théophile Gautier. When Jim woke up, or came to, he often had coffee and croissant by the square. He told many of the people he met that spring, including Philippe Dalecki, that the Place des Vosges was his favorite spot in Paris. Philippe Dalecki was Zozo's boyfriend. He was tall, sympathetic, about 20. He spoke good English, played guitar, and was recovering from a near-fatal motorcycle crash. Jim took a liking to him immediately. When Zozo was in Paris, Philip and Jim hung out together at number 17. He was very, very quiet, and so you wanted to be quiet around him, Philip says. You almost had the feeling like he was recovering from something, trying to get his strength again. His mannerisms, his way of walking were very slow, almost effeminate in a way. I didn't really know who he was, so it was very relaxed between us. We went out with the girls a few times to restaurants in the quarter or to a bar in the Marais or Les Halles. Jim and Pamela did not speak French, and both were shy in public, so they sort of stuck close together. But there was always a good feeling between us, and I really liked him a lot. One day, Philip and Zozo came by the apartment to drop off her luxurious fur coat in the closet of her locked bedroom. They found the atmosphere very tense, as if Jim and Pam had been arguing. Zozo and Pam spoke for a few moments while Philip sat with Jim. On the way downstairs, Zozo whispered, "Pamela just came in from having sex with another person." Philip asked how she knew. "She told me," girl to girl. One afternoon in early April, Jim was drinking on the terrace of Las Roques, a bistro on the Boulevard Saint-Germain. He heard some American voices at the next table and started a conversation. Jim said he had language difficulties in Paris, and the isolation of this was beginning to get to him. It was nice to hear some familiar voices. The Americans turned out to be members of Clinic, an American band trying to get a break in Europe. The leader, Phil Traynor, finally asked if he was Jim Morrison. Jim nodded yes. They said they hadn't known Jim was in Paris. Nobody knows, Jim said. Out came the guitars, and they jammed on blues songs for an hour or so. Jim was chain-smoking Marlboros and was coughing and spitting constantly. They all ended up drinking wine and whiskey at the apartment of someone Pamela knew. Jim smoked heavily, kept coughing, and got so loaded they had to put him in a taxi. It took 5 minutes for Jim to remember the address. Jim had cut down on alcohol when he first arrived in France, but after a month he started again. And the heavy, compulsive smoking began to take its toll. When Jim coughed up blood in April, Pamela told him to see a doctor at the American hospital in Neuilly. A physician exam and a lung x-ray turned up nothing obvious, and Jim was told to get some rest in a warm climate if possible. Jim and Pamela thought of the Côte d'Azur, where the Rolling Stones had just established themselves in their tax-related exile. But Jim wanted to see Spain and more of Morocco, so they left Paris in a rented car on April 10th and headed south into the lush and wet European spring. Jim Morrison drove their rented Peugeot sedan at a relaxed pace southwards toward Lyon and then headed for Spain. They picked up a few girl hitchhikers as they drove through southwest France, stopping for a night in Toulouse. The gray weather turned to sunshine after they crossed the Pyrenees and progressed through Catalonia. They both used the Super 8 movie camera, and a sequence shot at Madrid's Prado Museum shows Jim staring impassively at Hieronymus Bosch's immense The Garden of Earthly Delights, which Jim had written about in college, with hundreds of figures seething in various degrees of torment. Jim sat in front of the painting for an hour, completely transfixed. They then drove on to Andalusia, a pilgrimage Jim had wanted to make for years. In Granada, they visited the Alhambra, the great Moorish palace whose gardens, architecture, and vistas were one of the wonders of the world. Jim was so taken with the poetry of the site that he insisted on visiting for several days in a row. Pamela shot film of him sitting by the great fountain guarded by stone lions. Jim stood up, a beatific smile on his features, and walked towards the camera with his arms stretched wide, until only one Morrison eye filled the last frame of the sequence. They abandoned the car once they learned their insurance was no good once they crossed the Strait of Gibraltar. In Tangier, they stayed at both the Hotel Minze and at the palatial home of Paul and Talitha Getty. Paul was the eldest son of the founder of Getty Oil. Talitha was a lovely Dutch actress. She was a good friend of the notorious Jean de Breteuil and one of his clients as well, sharing her husband's taste for heroin. Talitha Getty would die of a heroin overdose in Rome later that year. While shopping in the European section of the old port town, Jim bought a copy of Paul Boyle's novel The Sheltering Sky at the Librairie de Cologne on Avenue Pasteur. Jim and Pamela flew on to Marrakech, the ancient red-walled desert cavern terminus, where the Comtesse de Breteuil, Jean's mother and the grande dame of expatriate society, lived in a splendor at the Villa Taylor, one of the great estates in the old palm oasis outside the tumult of the old city. Jean was then living in Keith Richards' London house, but Madame de Breteuil had already met Pamela and warmly received her and her husband. They were given the top-floor bedroom of the villa's tower with surrounding views of the snow-capped peaks of the Atlas Mountains. The Countess told them that Winston Churchill had often stayed there when he came to Marrakech to paint after the war. One of the servants functioned as their guide, and they spent days exploring the souks of the ancient Medina. Jim loved the warren of sandy streets, dark alleys, and mud walls. The women were veiled, and the men wore djellabas with pointed hoods that gave them privacy. The sounds and smells were those of Africa, Jim noted in a journal that he left behind. In the evenings they often ate in the savory open-air restaurant of the Jama el Fana, the Square of the Dead. This was where the old salt caravans had stopped after crossing the Sahara, and it now served as a bus terminal and market. After dinner, they watched teams of acrobats and various bands of traditional musicians who competed for coins. Jim listened intently to the professional storytellers who drew huge crowds of country folk with their shouted tales of magicians and jinns. Surviving Super 8 footage shows Jim and Pamela in a horse-drawn carriage, in the evening being driven out to the Manara Oasis as the sun set over the mountains. Jim wanted to swim in the hot desert air, so they moved to the Hotel Marrakech, which had a pool. One afternoon, Pamela came down to the pool wearing a new white silk djellaba, one she had bought in the souk. She saw a cool-looking guy she thought she knew, talking to a couple of girls. Drawing closer, she saw it was Jim. He had shaved off his beard during the night. His hair was brushed back. He looked like himself again. Later, she told friends in California that at that shining moment, she immediately fell in love with Jim all over again. Their trip lasted around 3 weeks. On May 3rd, 1971, Jim and Pam flew from Marrakech to Casablanca and then on to Paris. When they got to their apartment, Zozo and some friends were in temporary residence, so Jim and Pam checked into L'Hôtel, an exclusive small hotel in the Rue des Beaux-Arts. L'Hôtel was famous for its discretion, and many celebrities felt comfortable there. It was also famous because Oscar Wilde had died in one of its rooms. His famous last words, either that wallpaper goes or I do. Pamela had a huge problem now because Count de Breteuil was in London and she wanted heroin. Jim told a friend of Zozo's that he didn't want Pam scoring on the street. And anyway, he supposedly said, scoring is a man's job. Around that time, a Paris match photographer saw a friend sitting with Jim at the Café de Fleur and said hello. A few minutes later, the friend came over to his table, explained that Jim Morrison wanted some heroin and did he know where they could find some. The upscale junk-using denizens of Paris usually ended up at the Rock and Roll Circus, very late at night. The circus was a big discotheque on the Rue de Seine, modeled on the American Electric Ballrooms of the 60s. The walls were decorated with large murals of English rock stars and Jimi Hendrix dressed as clowns. The club was famous for Led Zeppelin having jammed there 2 years earlier, but now a somewhat sleazy reputation for the drug and sexual commerce in the dark downstairs bathrooms. Yet, it was often packed with French movie stars, and the new Chinese heroin, China White, was sold openly in the club's dark corners. If Jim was getting heroin for Pamela, he was not to be outdone in the self-destruction sweepstakes. He was drinking heavily to match her heroin stupor, and began to act out while they were still living at L'Hôtel. One rainy morning at dawn, he opened the tall window of their second-floor room to let in some air, and then stood up on the iron railing just outside. As Pam looked on, Jim either jumped or lost his balance and fell out the window. There was a loud thump. Pamela ran to the window and saw Jim sprawled on the roof of a parked car. When she got to the street, he was already whipping the muck off his suede jacket. She tried to get him to come up to bed so she could call a doctor, but Jim said he'd see her later and ran off to look for a drink. They were at L'Hôtel for a couple of weeks and then moved back to the Rue Beautreillis. Alain René, Jim's old friend from UCLA, arrived in Paris sometime in May and started hanging out. René spoke the language and could get things done. He helped Jim carry firewood up the 4 flights from the lobby because Jim thought the building's heat was inadequate and said he was cold unless he sat by the fire. Pamela was stoned and in a trance most of the time. Jim seemed angry and frustrated that she wasn't really living with him and was quite content with her own independent life and friends. As the days got warmer, Jim walked to the Place des Vosges almost every afternoon, sat in the dark shade of the plane trees near the sandbox, and wrote in his spiral notebooks. One day, he opened the Herald Tribune and read the obituary of Warhol's ex-muse, Eddie Sedgwick, who had died in California of an overdose of barbiturates. In May 1971, Gilles Yepremian was an 18-year-old rock musician fan who occasionally hung out with his friends at the Rock and Roll Circus in Paris in hopes of seeking some of his heroes. One late night, May 8th, 71, he was checking out the original French rock star, Johnny Hallyday, as Johnny and his entourage got increasingly rowdy in the club's restaurant. As Johnny got louder and more annoying, the club's tough bouncers started hovering nearby. Suddenly, Gilles saw what he describes as a shadow leaping over his left shoulder. This turned out to be Jim Morrison, who was electing to leave the crowded club by trampling over tables and across the laps of other customers. Drinks were knocked over in the dark, candles were upset, people were shouting. They wanted to throw Hallyday out of the Rock and Roll Circus, Gilles recalls. But they couldn't because this guy was a national icon. It was much easier to throw Jim out instead because they had no idea who he was. He looked like an American student passing through Europe in an old green army jacket, blue jeans, and boots. The bouncers tossed an extremely drunk Jim into the club's outdoor vestibule. Gilles Yepremian had recognized Jim and followed them outside. Jim tried to get back in, but a bouncer barred his way and Jim fell down. Jim began bothering other customers as they tried to step over him. Jim then started kicking the glass doors with his boots, and it looked like the bouncers were going to sort him out. Yepremian had the good sense to intervene. I asked him, "Jim, are you Jim?" He looked away and said, "Yeah." And I said, Okay, let's go. Come with me." Gilles got Jim upright and dragged him to a taxi idling outside on the Rue de Seine. Gilles asked Jim where he wanted to go, but Jim had passed out. The only place Gilles could think of to stash a comatose American rock star was the flat of his friend Hervé Muller, a well-known Parisian rock critic who was also France's premier Dylanologist. Gilles gave the driver Hervé's address, number 6 Place Tristan Bernard, and the taxi set off. As the sun was about to rise over Paris, Jim woke up while they were crossing the Pont de la Concorde over the Seine. "Stop the car," Jim shouted and jumped out. Gilles paid the driver and asked him to wait. Jim hopped onto the parapet of the bridge and began shouting. Gilles was afraid he was going to jump into the river. This also attracted the attention of 2 patrolling Paris cops, who stopped to see what was going on. "Jim," Gilles whispered, "take care. Police are coming." Jim shouted and cursed. Gilles got Jim back into the taxi, but the driver was hesitant until Jim threw a huge wad of francs into the front seat. The driver became even more nervous and gave back the money. When they arrived at Hervé's building, Jim was shouting again. Begging him to be quiet, it was 5 a.m, Gilles started helping Jim up the 6 flights of stairs to Muller's flat. This took 40 minutes. Halfway up, as Gilles was prodding him along like a mountain guide, Jim turned to Gilles and stage whispered, "Shh, everyone's asleep." Finally, they knocked at the door. Inside, the young writer was asleep with his girlfriend, Yvonne Foucault, who eventually opened the door a crack. A Belgian girl, a house guest, thought the knock was a police bust and was busy throwing her stash out a rear window. Muller, who wrote for the main French music magazine Rock et Folk, was incredulous. Gilles recalls the following. "I said to Hervé, 'It's me, and I have Jim Morrison with me.' Hervé answered, 'F off, Gilles, it's 6 a.m. But he opened the door, and Jim Morrison, really gone now, brushed past Hervé until he reached his bedroom. Jim collapsed on Hervé's bed and immediately passed out. They tried moving him, but this proved impossible. Hervé and Yvonne spent the rest of the morning sleeping in sleeping bags in the living room. When Jim finally woke up that afternoon, he washed and got dressed, walked into the main room, and asked Hervé Muller, 'Where am I?' Muller explained the situation. Jim shrugged, asked to borrow a hairbrush, and invited Hervé and Yvonne to breakfast at the Bar Alexandre. The food was superb, and Jim was in a good mood, discussing films and poetry and gently improving Hervé's command of California idiom. He talked about Pamela, saying they were just back from Morocco. He ordered a bottle of cognac, drank most of it out of his water glass, and soon got hellacious, bothering respectable people at nearby tables and throwing food. They normally didn't let hippies into the restaurant, but since Jim was already known for leaving obscenely large cash tips, the bistro staff left them alone. Hervé, not one to lose an opportunity, was taking photographs of the whole scene. After 2 hours, Jim staggered over to his favorite bench in front of the Alexandre and passed out. In late May of 1971, while Jim was living in Paris, the Doors office mailed him a copy of L.A. Woman, and Jim listened to it repeatedly. Ray Manzarek said that John Densmore then called Jim because the Doors were getting and turning down increasingly lucrative tour offers, since no one yet knew Jim had split. Gilles Yepremian said that when Jim got the Doors record, he did muse out loud about rejoining the band, but from the way he said it, Gilles could tell Jim didn't mean it. Doors manager Bill Siddons said he talked with Jim on 3 separate occasions. He said that Jim always seemed in good shape and sounded happy. Siddons told writer Patricia Butler, "We talked to him about coming back, and all we ever got was, no plans, I'm having a great time. Maybe someday we'll do another record, but no plans." Jim was also in touch with accountant Bob Green when his money ran low. He sent touristic postcards, "The women are great and food is gorgeous," to the office and wrote letters to Michael McClure and a girlfriend in San Diego. He and Pamela took a day trip to the Château de Corson, an old country mansion southwest of Paris famous for its gardens. Sometime during these days, Jim wrote 2 drafts of As I Look Back, a nostalgic poem that would remain unpublished for 20 years. His friend Alain Ronet remembered that in Paris, Jim often spoke about his parents with affection, telling funny stories about his family. Before he had left Los Angeles, Jim had heard through old Navy family channels that his mother was concerned for his health. In Paris, according to Ronet, Jim asked Pamela to call his parents in Washington to assure his mother that reports of his poor health were exaggerated. One day, Jim and Pamela came to lunch at Hervé's flat with Jim's new friends, Hervé and Yvonne, Gilles Yepremian, and another music journalist, Henri-Jean Henu. Pamela was mistrustful and didn't speak, preferring to hide behind Jim's shoulder. They opened a bottle of Corsican wine, but Jim hardly touched his. Hervé was surprised Jim didn't get drunk. Instead, Jim thanked Hervé for helping him when he was drunk and gave Muller a signed copy of his privately printed An American Prayer. Gilles Yepremian recalls the following. Jim was very friendly, but it wasn't possible to discuss the Doors with him. If we mentioned the music, he just turned off completely. End quote. Hervé says that Jim did say he felt too old to be a rock star at the age of 27. Jim mentioned that they were planning to drive to Switzerland, but Yvonne suggested they go to Corsica instead, because the wine they were drinking was so delicious and the weather would be warm. Pamela turned and asked, "Oh, Jim, can we go there?" He laughed and said, "Sure, babe, we'll go next week." After the meal, they sat down to listen to music. Jim was shown Hervé's vast record collection and asked to choose. Gilles said that for the rest of the afternoon, Jim spun all of Hervé's Buffy Sainte-Marie albums. On May 18th, Jim and Pam flew to Marseille on their way to Corsica. At the airport, Jim's shoulder bag was stolen. Gone were his wallet, passport, plane tickets, and several notebooks. They flew back to Paris, where Jim got new papers, then on to Corsica, where it rained for 10 days and they were bored. Footage from the trip features Jim and Pam wandering unhappily through a gloomy graveyard under lowering, ominous skies. One long evening early in June 1971, Jim and his friend Alain Ronet were standing on the top step of the long staircase leading up to Sacré-Cœur, the great white church at the summit of Montmartre in northern Paris. A band of black African musicians were banging away, and Jim stopped to listen a while. Gazing off to the east, Jim asked Ronet about the large green hill he could see. Ronet explained that it was Père-Lachaise, Paris's great cemetery. It dated from Napoleon's time and was where honored citizens like Chopin, Balzac, and Edith Piaf were buried. Jim insisted they visit immediately, but their taxi took an hour to fight through heavy traffic, and the gates were shut by the time they arrived. Jim and Elaine returned to the cemetery a few days later. They walked among the impressive monuments of the great artists and the florid 19th century tombs of the stolid bourgeoisie. When Ronet said he found the place a morbid experience, Jim protested that he liked the cemetery's spooky tranquility in the midst of the city, and that he definitely wanted to be buried in Père-Lachaise when he died. On June 11, 1971, Jim went to see a play. Hervé Muller had gotten press tickets for American director Robert Wilson's Le Regard du Sourd, English title Deaf Man Glance, at the Théâtre de la Musique. Pamela didn't want to go, so Alain Ronet used her ticket. It was a colorful avant-garde production performed in French, enlivened by Wilson's bold staging that combined elements of architecture and painting. Wilson later famously collaborated with composer Philip Glass on the opera Einstein on the Beach. But the pacing was very slow and Jim became bored and thirsty and wanted to leave after the first act. Ronet persuaded Jim to stay, and later Jim seemed fascinated by the final tableau of naked actors pretending to be dead surrounding the assassinated revolutionary Marat, who had been stabbed to death while laying in his bed. After the play, they went to a cafe for drinks. Jim thanked Hervé Muller for the evening. It was the last time Hervé saw Jim Morrison. The last notebook Jim Morrison worked on is now in a private collection in Paris. He had obviously started the spiral-bound steno pad before he left LA, since the first entry is Cohenga Auto 4663268. The first 20 pages of the notebook are full of stanzas and imagery written in Jim's large-lettered handwriting. There are almost no crossouts, as if the notebook represented a confident and finished sequence of poems. Several pages are variants of older poems, such as The Ancient Ones, Winter Photography, and The Hitchhiker. Other pages contain only 1 or 2 lines, but variations in the writing style indicate they may have been thought over for days. The notebook contains both wonderful new poems and scabrous jottings. The lyrics for a new song, Now You Are in Danger, go as follows. Let the piper call the tune, March, April, May, June. The next page continues short lyrics for a blues song. We're two of a kind, you want years and I want mine. Page 17 of the notebook contains 1 line, She'll get over it. This notebook was in Jim's plastic bag along with 2 tape boxes, Jim's photo file, and some random papers when Jim ran into Philip Dalecki in the street. Jim thought he had recorded something interesting in Orange County Suite, but couldn't listen to the tape reel because he only had a cassette player at home. Philippe Dalecki, an acquaintance of Jim's in France, recalls the following. I remember that I was walking along Rue de Rivoli when I ran into Jim. We had a drink together in a bar, and he said he needed to make a cassette from a reel-to-reel tape he had in his bag. I said I could help him and went over to my place, 5 Rue Chagrin, near the Place de l'Étoile, about a 5-minute walk from the bar. I had a little home studio with a Revox tape recorder and a K7 cassette deck, so I did the job. We had another drink, then Jim quickly left with the cassette, like he was really excited to listen to it. I went back to the studio and noticed Jim's plastic sack on the floor. I ran to the window, but he was already halfway down the block. I shouted, Hey Jim, you forgot this. He looked back at me over his shoulder and shouted, All right, keep it. See you later. Bye. Philippe put the bag in a drawer. The next day, he went to Saint-Tropez in the south of France with Zozo, who had a film job. He never saw Jim Morrison again. On June 29, 1971, a few days before Jim Morrison's death, Jim Morrison's secretary Robin Wardle was working with him. She was trying to reach someone at the Cinematheque to discuss Jim's films, which now included a recently received print of Granada TV's agitprop documentary, The Doors Are Open. But no one was interested. The Doors had never played in France because the second European tour had been cancelled during Jim's trial in Miami. Outside of a few thousand fans of American rock, Jim Morrison was unknown in his palace of exile. Jim also dictated a letter to the Doors accountant, Bob Green, which was typed, undated, by Robin Wardle and mailed on June 28, 1971. In it, Jim was adamant about cutting ties to his former life, saying that, quote, Paris is beautiful in the sun, an exciting town built for human beings, end quote, and asking if it would be possible to stay here indefinitely. He also asked Green to send a financial statement and a copy of the Doors partnership agreement, and informed him that he and Pamela had decided to turn over Themis to Pamela's sister and her husband so that they could eventually be completely clear of any involvement. Themis, of course, being Pamela Corson's clothing store, which Jim Morrison helped finance. In conclusion, Jim Morrison wrote the following. Any luck on the credit cards? We could use them made out to both our names. What's the problem? And if you'd send our check when you receive this, house bills are catching up. Please send $3,000, about $25,000 in current money. Give our best to all. Later, Jim. According to highly unreliable accounts, something very bad apparently happened to Jim Morrison on one of the last nights in June. One of Jim Morrison's friends in Paris, Hervé Muller, whose life was later threatened when he conducted his own investigation into Jim's last days, found people in the heroin underworld who swore that Jim had bought some smack from a Chinese dealer called Le Chinois, and a local kid known as Petit Robert, in the basement bathroom of the Rock and Roll Circus Club in Paris. They claim that Jim has snorted a big load, passed out, and turned blue. Someone murmured, Il est mort. He is dead. The people he was with, two guys, carried Jim out of the bathroom through the kitchen the circus shared with the adjacent Alcazar nightclub and out of the Alcazar's entrance on the Rue Mazarin. They bundled Jim into a cab, got him upstairs on the Rue Beautreillis where Jim's apartment was, threw him into the bathtub, and split. Somehow, Jim came through it and recovered. This unverifiable but often repeated story that Jim Morrison had OD'd at the Rock and Roll Circus became part of the local drug lore and will forever cast doubt on what really happened to Jim 2 nights later. No one still alive can say with complete confidence what took place in the 4th floor at 17 Rue Beautreillis on the morning of July 3rd, 1971. Only 2 people could have, Pamela Corson and Jean de Breteuil, who were fully party to the tragic death of Jim Morrison, but both died soon after. It is, however, accurate to say that in the frenzied days immediately following July 3rd, an improvised, risky, remarkably skillful, and cynical cover-up abetted by the detrimentally lax procedures of the local authorities enabled an American rock star's sordid and potentially scandalous heroin overdose with obvious but messy criminal implications and enormous financial consequences to be officially decreed a common heart attack by the city of Paris. Pamela Corson told several versions of her story. One to the police, one to friends Alan Ronay and Agnes Varda, and others to friends in California over the next 3 years. Jean de Breteuil blurted out his story in Morocco, where he felt safe 3 days after the events. Jim Morrison's friend in Paris, Hervé Muller, published findings that indicated Jim had really died in the bathroom of the Circus Club a day or so earlier. Taking all these sometimes dubious, thinly sourced narratives into account, one can construct a speculative timeline that considers all the variants of the painful, heartbreaking final hours of Jim Morrison's life. Pamela Corson said they did go to the movie. On a bright and warm summer's night, they walked through the village Saint-Paul, past the crumbling old city wall, down the narrow passage Charlemagne, and found a cab at the Saint-Paul taxi stand. The film, Pursued, was director Raoul Walsh's attempt to inject a film noir sensibility into the standard Hollywood Western format. It was playing, ironically, in an art house near the Pelletier Metro. After the movie, they ate some sweet and sour Chinese food at one of the late-night restaurants on the Rue Saint-Antoine. Jim washed his food down with several beers. At 1 o'clock, they called it a night and went back to their flat. Jim was restless. He was sipping whiskey out of the bottle, possibly in pain from his various injuries and ailments. He sat at his desk with an open notepad, but couldn't focus. Pamela was cutting lines of heroin on a mirror with a credit card. They both began snorting the drug using rolled-up money. Jim started threading Super 8 films of their travels into the projector. Pamela said they sang together as they watched their dark, jerky, out-of-focus movies of Spain, Morocco, and Corsica on the wall. Jim, according to Pamela in all her narratives, played old Doors records, even The End, far into the night. Between reels, they broke for lines of the strong Chinese drug. If the neighbors can be believed, early that morning, Jim Morrison became very upset. Raging, he opened the apartment's door and went into the hall before someone dragged him back in and slammed the door. A year later, the woman who lived directly upstairs told Philippe and Zozo that on the night her friend had died, she had been awakened by a disturbance. She had opened her door with the chain on and had looked out to see Monsieur Douglas, aka Jim Morrison, naked and screaming on the staircase. According to Pamela, Jim started coughing again and had trouble clearing his throat. Pamela eventually told Jim they should go to bed. It was 3 o'clock on Saturday morning. Jim asked Pamela for another line or two before bed. It was her stuff bought from Jean, and at home she was the one who handled it, although she also maintained that Jim had his own stash as well. Jim was still awake when Pamela nodded off in a heroin stupor. She woke up maybe an hour later. It was 4 o'clock in the morning and very dark. Jim, lying next to her, was gurgling horribly. It sounded like he was drowning in his own mucus. But she had heard this before and tried to wake him up. She couldn't rouse him. She slapped his face, nothing. She hit him hard again and again until he began to come to. An awful scene now ensued. Rousing himself in obvious pain, Jim staggered to the bathroom. Someone, Pamela couldn't remember who, turned on the water in the tub, and Jim lowered himself in. Pamela went back to bed and passed out again. She awoke in a cold sweat to terrible retching sounds. Jim Morrison, still in the bath, was now vomiting up chunks of pineapple and vivid clots of blood. Pamela rushed into the kitchen, fetched an orange Le Creuset saucepan, and ran back into the bathroom. Jim vomited some more into the saucepan. When the nausea passed, she flushed the stuff down the toilet. She later said she thought she had to empty and wash out the basin 3 times. She said that Jim now told her he felt better and to go back to sleep. Sometime around 5 o'clock, as the sky was turning light, Pamela Corson, overcome with heroin fatigue, fell back into bed. As she was drifting off, she thought she heard Jim calling out to her, "Pamela, are you there?" Perhaps an hour later, Pamela woke up again. Jim hadn't come back to bed. Morning light filtered through the covers of the windows. She got up and went to the bathroom. The door was locked from the inside. She shouted at Jim, rattled the heavy door, but there was no response. At 6:30 on Saturday morning, Pamela called Jean de Breteuil, who was in bed with Marianne Faithfull. Marianne was stoned, but remembered when the call came in. "I gotta go, baby," Jean said. That was Pamela Morrison. That woke Marianne up. "Jean, listen to me. I've got to meet Jim Morrison." "Not possible, baby. Not cool right now, okay? Je t'explique later. I'm right back." He was at the flat within half an hour. Pamela, dressed in her white silk jalaba, was out of her mind and incoherent. Jean calmed her down, broke a glass pane in the bathroom door, turned the lock, and let himself in. They found Jim Morrison dead, still in the bathtub. Blood was still drying under his nose and mouth, as if he had violently hemorrhaged. There were 2 large and lividly purple bruises on his chest. The bath water was dark pink, as if Jim bled out until his heart stopped. Pamela later said that he looked relaxed for the first time in months, his head turned slightly to his left, a slight smile on his lips. He had such a serene expression, Pamela said later, if it hadn't been for all that blood. Pamela started slapping Jim, talking to him, freaking out. Then she got halfway into the tub with Jim before Jean pulled her away and dragged her out of the bathroom. With cool calculation, amid terror and considerable anguish, Jean told Pamela that he was leaving town. Janis Joplin, who had OD'd on the heroin that Jean sold her, was one thing. Jim Morrison was another. The Paris police had already opened a dossier on his drug-dealing activities. Jean told Pamela that now they all had to get out of Paris as soon as possible. He and Marianne would leave for Morocco that night. Jean told Pamela that if she could get to Morocco, where his family had great influence, he would be able to protect her, if any legal questions arose. Jim had no track marks on his body. Autopsies were only performed in France on suspicion of murder. Jean told Pamela that police would soon be in the house and to flush any drugs she had. She could tell the medical examiner that Jim had heart disease. Pamela asked Jean what to do next. "Call your other friends," Jean said. "Get them to help you. I will see you again before I leave. I'm sorry, darling. I love you. Goodbye." Jean de Breteuil left 17 Rue Beautreillis around 7:30 on Saturday morning. Pamela padded back into the bathroom to talk things over with Jim Morrison, who had died alone about 90 minutes earlier at the age of 27. No one knows for sure where Count de Breteuil went after he left Pamela alone with Jim Morrison's body soaking in the bathtub. After several hours, he arrived back at l'hotel where Marianne Faithfull was waiting. She said that he was stoned but also very agitated. He woke her and she asked what had happened. Jean then dragged her out of bed and beat her up. When he had finished, Marianne lit a cigarette. "Get packed," he growled. "We're going to Morocco. I want you to meet my mother." But we just got here, Marianne replied. Jean didn't care. Marianne was getting the picture. They were blowing town fast. What happened there? She asked. Jean replied by saying, shut up. Marianne now got it. Marianne recalls the following. Jean was scared for his life. Jim Morrison had OD'd and he had provided the smack. Jean saw himself as a dealer to the stars. Now he was just a small-time heroin dealer in big trouble. He was very young. Had he lived, he might have turned into a human being. There is one clue as to the Count's movements after he left Pamela. At an all-night disco called La Boule, on the Rue de la Montagne Saint-Geneviève, there was a weird announcement made over the sound system that morning by American DJ Cameron Watson. Sometime around 8 o'clock, after a word with a couple of dope dealers who had stopped by his booth, and with only a handful of customers left in the club, Watson stopped the music and said, Jim Morrison died this morning. Then, he repeated the news in French. He was, mysteriously, the first person to announce Jim Morrison's death. Agnes Varda, Jim's close friend, had her phone ring at about 7:30 on Saturday morning. Partner and fellow friend of Jim Morrison's, Alain Ronet, awoke and answered it, but the line was dead. It rang again a few moments later. Monique Godard, the yoga healer, was calling to say that she was leaving Paris that day, but during the night, she had a feeling that Ronet's American friend, Jim Morrison, who she was introduced to, had to see a doctor immediately. She said, if your friend wants my help, he must see a doctor first. Does he take drugs? Does he have circulatory problems? Ronet said he had contacted her to help Pamela, not Jim. In response, she said the following. Her? I would never take her on, never. Listen, your friend must see a doctor immediately. I feel these things. It could even be too late. Ronet asked Godard if she had called a few minutes earlier, but she said no. Again told Ronet to take care of his friend and hung up. The phone immediately rang again. It was Pamela Corson, speaking very softly. Ronet told her to speak up, and then heard the fear in her voice. Jim is unconscious, Hélène. He's bleeding. Can you call an ambulance for me? You know I can't speak French. Oh, please hurry. I think he may be dying. Pamela couldn't say anything else because she was sobbing. She hung up. Ronet dressed and crossed Varda's courtyard to wake her. She immediately called the Paris Fire Department's emergency line. The rescue squad was the best chance for anyone in a medical crisis in Paris to stay alive. She ordered Ronet to write down Jim's address for her and told him to write a note to Bertolucci and the maid that they were leaving in an emergency. She told Ronet to bring his American passport, because they would need it when the police arrived. Varda drove them in her old Volkswagen Beetle. They were delayed by a political demonstration on the Ile de la Cité. The students were leafletting the drivers, explaining their grievances. Ronet was almost pissing himself in fear. Weaving through traffic, Varda finally got them to Rue Beautreillis about 9:30 in the morning. Fire trucks, an ambulance, and a small crowd held back by a police officer were in front of number 17. When they got upstairs, Pamela was in the apartment's foyer, still dressed in her wet djellaba, surrounded by firemen. My Jim is dead, Elaine, Pamela said. I want to be alone now. Please leave me alone. Ronet was stunned. He glanced over at Jim's empty boots in the hallway, one in front of the other, as if he'd just stepped out of them. When the fire rescue squad had arrived a few minutes earlier, they had lifted Jim out of the bath and laid him out on the floor. They tried cardiac massage briefly, but the body was already cold. They had carried Jim to his bedroom and placed him on the bed. Pamela covered Jim with a blanket. Agnes Varda asked the fire chief if he was sure Jim was dead. With tender courtesy, the chief replied that the resident had been dead for at least an hour before they had arrived. Varda went into the bedroom to be with Pamela. A police inspector then arrived. When Varda came into the hallway, Ronet whispered to her not to let them know who Jim was or who she was either. Don't exaggerate, Varda replied. Believe me, they have no idea my films even exist. The inspector began to grill Ronet. How did you know Mr. Douglas Morrison, one of Jim Morrison's incognito names in France? After establishing that Ronet was an American citizen, he asked about Jim's age, nationality, and occupation. What about the girlfriend? Did they use drugs? He turned and asked the paramedics to write a full statement. Ronet then told them, my friend's name was Douglas Morrison. Douglas James Morrison, an American. He was a poet. He was an alcoholic, but no, he didn't use drugs. The inspector was skeptical. Looking around the flat, he remarked that poets don't usually live in such bourgeois surroundings. If he was really a poet, as you say, how could he afford some place like this? Ronet replied that Mr. Morrison lived on a private income, then pleaded that he was traumatized and couldn't answer questions. The inspector backed off a bit. and said that if the medical examiner's report was satisfactory, the police would certify a death certificate and a burial permit. Otherwise, there would be an inquiry. Then he left. The bedroom door was closed. A hotel sign brought back from Morocco hung on the doorknob. It read, "Do not disturb" in French and Arabic. Suddenly, the door opened and all the firemen filed out and left the apartment. They were now alone. Ronay couldn't bring himself to go in. All he saw were Jim's bare feet hanging off the edge of the bed. Pamela came into the hall, still in her jalaba. Ronay told her he had reversed Jim's name for the police, and she said she had done the same thing. Agnes then came out and took them into the salon. "Tell us what happened," Ronay urged Pamela. "We won't be alone much longer." Pamela began to pick at the embroidered silk threads of the sleeves of the jalaba. They went to the movies, she said. They ate and came home. They sniffed heroin. Varda asked, "Who had it? You?" "Of course," Pam answered, almost proudly. "I'm the one who holds it." She turned to Ronay and said, "Hélène, why haven't you seen him yet? My Jim, man, he's so beautiful. You should check this out. Go see." Ronay ignored her. What happened next? Pamela told them about the films, the records, the coughing and breathing problems, and the crisis that led Jim to the bathtub. She left out the mad scene in the hallway, the bathroom door locked from the inside, and the involvement of Jean de Breteuil. Both women began to weep. Agnes, overcome, took Pamela's hand. The telephone rang. Varda said something about the phone possibly being tapped. The caller was Jean de Breteuil. Ronay went out to buy cigarettes. The ambulance was still in front of the building. A few people were still gathered, gossiping about the young foreigner they had often seen walking through the corridor for the past several months, who had died in the night. There was still no idea of who he really was. But 2 long-haired young dudes in silk scarves and leather jackets were loitering as well, and they followed Hélène up the steps. They introduced themselves as Jean and Jean-Louis and asked to see Pam. When Ronay protested, Jean said, "Look, she called me, and I know everything." Varda appeared, ready to brook no nonsense. "I lived with Pam for 6 months," the Count blurted. "She wants to see me." Varda told him to get out, but Pamela emerged from the bedroom. She called the Count to the other bedroom. They sat on the bed and talked for a while. Ronay interrupted them. There would be a scandal if the Count was there when the medical examiner and the cops arrived. They had to get Jim buried before questions could be asked. As he was leaving, Jean told Ronay that both his London digs and his Moroccan homes were at Pamela's disposal. On his way out, the Count tripped over something that was under the carpet of the foyer. It was a hash pipe. Jean put it into his pocket and left with his friend. That evening, he and Marianne Faithfull took the night flight to Casablanca. Back at the flat, Pamela assured Ronay that all the dope had been flushed. She went into the bedroom carrying a pile of papers and copies of an American prayer and locked them in Jim's desk. Agnes said she wanted to leave before the medical examiner arrived and told Pamela that she could stay at her house. When Varda left, Pamela started to burn papers in the fireplace. Anything with Jim's name on it went up in smoke. She also burned some of her own letters, a journal, and files relating to Jim's various arrests in Los Angeles. Ronay said he thought the cops would smell the fire on what was turning out to be the hottest day of the summer and ask questions. Pamela didn't care. Some of her letters, she explained, were like diary entries about Jim and drugs. She then produced an application for a marriage license from Denver from 1967. She asked, "Will they accept this? Do they know English?" Ronay assured her that it wouldn't work. Next, Pamela broke into Zozo's padlocked bedroom with the fireplace hatchet and emerged wearing a full-length mink coat. "It's mine now," she told Ronay. "I'm taking it with me. She'll never give me back all the money we paid her in advance." Ronay said later that he convinced Pamela that she was in enough trouble already and she hung the fur coat back in the closet. The doorbell rang. It was the doctor, a short, stocky, middle-aged man carrying a black bag. "Where's the corpse?" he asked. Ronay pointed to the bedroom. Following legal procedure, the doctor demanded that Ronay accompany him to lay out the body. Ronay begged off because he didn't want to see Jim, but Pamela then appeared, apparently in a trance. Speaking in an artificial voice, she took the doctor's arm. "This is my very beautiful man, sir," she said, as she took him into the bedroom. The exam was completed in less than 5 minutes. The doctor came out and asked Ronay to translate Pamela's answers to his questions. He asked for Jim's age and was shocked when he was told he was 27. "I was going to write 57, the doctor told Ronay. He asked if Jim ever used drugs and was told no, never. Ronay tried to tell him about the coughing spasms, but the doctor waved him off. "All right, I understand," he said. He filled out a form and handed it to Ronay with an envelope. "Take this to the civil registry of the 4th arrondissement," he said, "and show it to the clerk. They will give you the death certificate." Then he offered his condolences to Pamela and left abruptly. It was now around noon. Renee said that they then went to get something to eat. Then they went to get the death certificate. The office, though, was closed, so they came back later. The lone woman on duty on a sleepy Saturday afternoon scanned the papers and told them that their request for a death certificate due to natural causes would be denied. She made a phone call and handed the receiver to Elaine. The prefect of police angrily told Renee to get back to number 17 within 10 minutes. The police arrived half an hour later. They found Pamela sitting demurely in the bedroom next to Jim's body. She was holding hands with Jim, talking to him quietly. The inspector, Captain Barry, was brisk and unsympathetic. Jim had been cleaned up with no traces of blood or any needle marks. The police quickly inspected the apartment and found nothing. The fresh ashes in the fire grate went unnoticed, but Captain Barry was bothered by the scene. He obviously smelled something very wrong and 20 years later told an interviewer that he thought Mr. Morrison had overdosed on drugs. He arranged for the senior medical examiner to arrive later to look at the corpse. Finally, he told Pamela that if the new doctor found nothing amiss, they would receive the death certificate and burial permit. Renee asked when they could remove Jim's body. Captain Barry replied that they couldn't. It might have to be sent to the police morgue for analysis. The corpse will remain here until further instruction, he told Renee. The only problem will be the heat of the next few days. Renee protested that this would inflict great cruelty on Pamela, but the officer was unmoved. He said certain normal arrangements for this would be made, and that they now had to come with him to the Quartier de l'Arsenal police headquarters to make a statement. Pamela and Renee sat in the back of the police sedan. Renee whispered to Pamela to cry a lot and make it look good. In an office upstairs, a triplicate official form was rolled into the typewriter and Pamela began telling her story in English, which the inspector now told them he knew perfectly well. Pamela perked up a bit and spoke with some animation. She said that the movie they had seen was called Death Valley. She left out the heroine, Jim's outburst, and the count, so she blundered into several inconsistencies and mistakes. As police sirens sounded outside, Renee was afraid she was telling too much and could get herself in trouble now. So, the inspector asked, disgusted, you abandoned him 3 times to empty the basin you said he vomited in? 3 times? And where did you empty and wash the basin? Pamela said the sink, which Renee thought was the wrong answer. The inspector looked at her sharply. When she described her violent efforts to arouse Jim by hitting him in the face, Barry shook his head in obvious contempt. Turning to Renee, he fired off questions in French. Let's get this finished. What was this girl to him? Renee answered, she was practically his wife. The cop wrote concubine, the official word for unmarried spouse. Did they have sexual relations the night he died? Pamela answered no. Finished typing, Captain Barry told him to go back to the apartment to receive the new medical examiner. Once inside the flat, Pamela had a fit. She shouted at Renee that she couldn't understand what was going on, that he had to make her understand what was being said. Renee was scared for himself as well. It crossed his mind that if Jim had been murdered, he could be implicated in covering up the crime. He didn't yet know that Pamela was Jim's sole heir. It's possible also that Pamela didn't know either. Renee, trying to control his emotions, told Pamela that she just had to trust him. Dr. Max Vasile arrived around 6 o'clock, carrying a black leather bag. Jim had been dead for 12 hours now. Vasile was an older gentleman, relaxed, and he smiled at them. He walked briskly into Jim's room and walked out again within a minute. He had a quick look at the bathtub. In the dining room, he told Pamela and Renee that he thought it was strange that so young a man who seemed to be in good condition should just die in the bathtub like that. Renee told Dr. Vasile about the heavy drinking and the violent coughing spells he had witnessed. Vasile stood up. He told him that if their statements were accurate, and could not be immediately proven otherwise, he was inclined to say that Mr. Morrison had died of a heart attack caused by blood clots in the cardiac artery. He was now going to the Arsenal station to file his report. He advised them to rest for an hour. You both look very tense, and then join him at the station. Vasile took Pamela's hand and offered his condolences. He took her wrist to feel her pulse and nodded that she seemed all right. After he left, and it looked for the first time that day that they might be in the clear with the authorities, Pamela fell apart and began to cry. Then, when her tears were dry, she had a tantrum. Valium, she screamed at Renee. I want Valium. Give some to me now. Renee said he'd flushed his pills down the toilet. Pamela started crashing around the apartment until she found a few that she had stashed herself. After she calmed down, Pamela said she wanted Jim cremated and his ashes scattered someplace he liked. Renee said cremation was very rare in France, and that an autopsy was always required first. Renee told Pamela about Père Lachaise and suggested they try to bury Jim there, near Chopin, Sarah Bernhardt, Molière, or Claude Debussy. This seemed reasonable to her. Pamela began going through the pockets of Jim's clothes, collecting about $200 in francs in a glass jar. She would need cash for the funeral. She would have to call one of the people she hated, Bill, the door's manager, Bob, the accountant, Max, the lawyer, and get some money out of them. And they all hated her, too. Ronay pointed out that the American banks were shut until Tuesday because of the 4th of July holiday. She decided to ask Bill Siddons to bring the money personally. Ronay suggested calling the Morrisons in Washington. "We don't have to worry about that," Pamela said coldly. While Pamela leafed through some old photos of Jim, Ronay then called Agnes Varda. When they went to the police station, they would have to reveal the true order of Jim's name. Someone might notice, and the story could leak out and cause an uproar. Varda had a press baron friend, whose wife Ronay had once escorted to a Doors concert in Los Angeles. Ronay says that Varda's connection worked for 4 straight days to keep Jim's death off the prefecture of the police's death toll, and any mention of a rock star in Paris suddenly dying out of the papers. Captain Barry received them coolly at the Arsenal station. At 7:30, he handed them the death certificate, backdated to 2:30 that afternoon, and the burial permit. He asked for Jim's passport, which had to be turned over to the American embassy. To avoid giving Jim's real name, Ronay lied that they had left it at the flat. Besides, the embassy would be closed until Tuesday because of the American Independence Day. The inspector said that they could return it themselves and that they were free to go. "What about the body?" Ronay asked. "Leave him where he is for now," Barry said, and picked up the phone. The doorbell rang at 8 o'clock, only a few moments after Pamela Corson and Elaine Ronay returned to the flat where Jim Morrison lay dead. Ronay was making tea, so Pamela answered the door. After a commotion, she shouted to Elaine, asking if he had ordered some ice cream. When he went to investigate, he found a small mortician in a dark suit carrying a plastic bag and 25 pounds of dry ice. The police inspector had sent him. Shown into Jim's room, he wrapped the corpse in the bag with the ice. On the way out, he gave his card to Ronay, told him that he would visit regularly until the funeral. "Believe me," he said, "I'll do my best. But this heat is against us." Ronay told him that Pam wanted to sleep next to the body. The mortician looked pained and said that he strongly advised against it. Ronay left also to get some badly needed rest. On that Sunday, July 4th, 1971, no one yet knew that Jim Morrison was dead. Pamela seemed better when Ronay returned late that morning. The Iceman had already been and gone. Pamela was exhausted, but told Ronay that having Jim in the house made her feel secure. She said that if they could do it, they would live like this forever. The Iceman came again late in the day. He repacked Jim and explained to Ronay that with the continuing heat wave Paris was enduring, the current situation would become impossible to sustain by Tuesday. That evening, Elaine Ronay spoke with a well-connected Paris lawyer who had been contacted by Agnes Varda in case there were problems with the police. The phone rang for the first time that night. Ronay thought it was someone from Electra's London office. Pamela said Jim wasn't home and hung up. Word was getting out. A Radio Luxembourg disc jockey named Jean-Bernard Herbet had heard the mysterious announcement the other night at La Boule about Jim's death and mentioned it on his show, later on Sunday. A Paris party girl told her journalist friend that she had heard the disc jockey at La Boule announcing Jim's death, and she knew that Jim was in Paris. The journalist checked the wire services and found nothing. His editor told him to call the record company for a statement. In London, Electra's executive Clive Selwyn was soon asked if Jim Morrison had died in Paris. Selwyn replied that he had no idea Jim was even in Paris. He called Electra executives in Los Angeles. Someone got him Jim's phone number. There was no answer. Then, a woman finally picked up and said that Jim wasn't home. So he called Bill Siddons, the band manager. On Monday, after a second night spent lying next to her decomposing boyfriend, Pamela consented to a burial as soon as possible. Ronay walked across the river and found the house of Bigot, the undertaker, in the shadows of the twin spires of Notre Dame Cathedral, where the old monastic cloister had once stood. Mr. Guillard, the director, explained that everyone wanted to rest at Père Lachaise and there were very few spaces left. Ronay pleaded that Douglas Morrison, Jim Morrison's incognito name, had been a famous young American writer. Guillard brightened. A writer? I know a space. In Division 89, very close to another famous writer, Mr. Oscar Wilde. Ronay was shocked. No, I beg you, not next to Oscar Wilde. Please, can you find another space? A small double plot was found near a memorial to victims of Nazi oppression in Paris in a less desirable location on the other side of the hill. The funeral was arranged for Wednesday morning, July the 7th. On Monday afternoon, the undertakers came to the flat, dressed Jim in a too large dark suit, and stuffed him into a too small wood veneer coffin. Pamela gathered all the pictures of herself that she had and placed them in the coffin. The coffin was then sealed tightly with screws to delay further decay in the hot, dark apartment. Pamela later said she had never seen Jim in a suit before. She said she thought he looked kinda cute. On Monday, July 5th, 2 days after Jim Morrison's death, the Doors manager Bill Siddons got a phone call in his Los Angeles home at 4:30 in the morning. Before he picked up, Cherry Siddons said, "Something's happened to Jim." It was Clive Selwyn, the Elektra Records executive in London, calling with the worst possible news. Siddons called Jim's Paris number, but no one answered. He tried again at 8 in the morning. This time, Pamela picked up. She sounded very nervous. Bill told her there were rumors that Jim had died. "No," she said, "that isn't true." Siddons then asked to speak with Jim, and Pamela began to sob. He told her he wanted to help her and booked a seat on the next plane to Paris. Then he called Ray Manzarek. Ray said they'd heard these types of rumors before, but Siddons said it seemed different this time. Ray said he couldn't believe it without some proof. Among the other Doors, no one was surprised, and there were not a lot of tears shed for Jim. Bill Siddons arrived at 17 Rue Beautreillis in Paris, Jim's apartment, at 9 o'clock on Tuesday morning. He found Pamela with Jim's secretary, Robin Wardle. They explained that Jim was in his coffin, which had been sealed for health reasons. Pamela was distraught and preoccupied with getting her things packed so she could go home. Jim Morrison's friend Alain Ronay arrived and explained the situation, and they all agreed to keep the death and the funeral secret as long as they could. Robin took Pamela to the American Embassy to file a death report and return Jim's passport later in the day. Pamela was listed in the report as James Morrison's girlfriend. No one mentioned anything about Jim Morrison, because Jim was under the incognito names of Douglas or James Morrison in France, and they left quickly and hoped no one would notice. Sometime that day, Siddons opened a small, ornate Chinese box he found on a bureau in the apartment. He tasted the white powder it contained and later said he thought it was heroin. Pamela was listed as Jim's cousin on the burial certificate. Notarized on Wednesday morning. At 11 o'clock, a small procession wound its way up the cobblestones from the main gate of Père Lachaise, one of the most famous cemeteries in France. Jim was carried up the hill on a noisy, motorized cart, followed by several pallbearers, the undertaker, and his friends, Pamela, Ronay, Agnes Varda, Robin Wardle, and Bill Siddons. They stopped at grave number 5, second row, 6th division. The pallbearers laid the coffin by the grave. There was no priest, no religious observance. Pamela cleared her throat and said in a soft voice that Jim wanted a few lines recited when he died. From memory, she whispered the last lines of Jim's poem, Celebration of the Lizard. Now night arrives with her purple legion. Retire now to your tents and to your dreams. Tomorrow we enter the town of my birth. I want to be ready. The funeral lasted about 8 minutes. Then everyone left. No one lingered at the grave to witness the interment. A couple of elderly French widows tending to their late husbands' graves in the same division witnessed Jim Morrison's funeral. They said they thought the mourners had been in an unseemly hurry. They thought it was a shame to have a funeral without a priest. They walked over to the abandoned grave when the workmen had finished filling it in. They saw only a small square of freshly turned earth. There was no headstone, and there would be none for many years. One of the women brought over a faded plastic rose from a nearby grave and laid it on Jim Morrison's. Then there was nothing but the quiet, pretty summer day under the shady trees of the old cemetery. They all helped Pamela to pack her things, except Agnes Varda, who'd had quite enough. Jim Morrison's death inspired the critical scene in The Last Tango in Paris, filmed shortly afterward, in which Marlon Brando's character speaks to the laid-out corpse of his wife, who has killed herself. It took 25 shipping boxes to get Pamela ready to travel, including a metal case containing Jim's manuscripts and notebooks. Even so, she would leave a lot behind. Bill Siddons was on the last plane to LA on Thursday night. When he arrived the next day, he drove to the Doors workshop and said, "Well, we buried Jim yesterday." Late that night, he called the band's publicists, Gary Stromberg and Bob Gibson. Their answering service found them getting drunk at Dan Tana's. They had to break into their own offices because neither had a key. They asked Robert Hilburn, the pop writer for the Los Angeles Times, to come over at 3 in the morning and then began working on a press release and a statement from the Doors about the death of Jim Morrison. Pamela Courson also flew home with Siddons that night, having left her old man in the soil of Paris, along with a lot of unanswered questions. She was the sole heir to Jim Morrison's fortune, but first there would be hell to pay in California. The reporter from the Washington Post reached Admiral Steve Morrison at home in Arlington, Virginia. The reporter asked him for a comment on his son's death in Paris. There was silence. The Admiral said he hadn't heard anything about it. The reporter said he had just confirmed the story with the Doors manager, Bill Siddons. Admiral Morrison said that if Siddons said it happened, it probably was true. He then asked the reporter to call back with any further information. Admiral Morrison later called the naval attaché at the American Embassy in Paris to confirm the story. The Morrison family was said to be very broken up about Jim's death. About a month later, Jim's passport was returned to his parents, Steve and Clara Morrison. The man who supplied Pamela and Jim with the heroin that ended up killing Jim, Jean de Breteuil, died himself of a heroin overdose later that year in 1971. Pamela Corson died of a heroin overdose in 1974. End quote. The Doors' legacy is one filled with many ups and downs. Despite the various tensions over the years, thankfully at present, the surviving members of the Doors, John Densmore and Robbie Krieger, seem to be on good terms, both with each other and with the overall history of the band. The following is a quote from John Densmore from 2020, where he talks about Jim Morrison. This quote is from his book, The Seekers. Quote, I was jamming at Manzarek's garage when Ray handed me a crumpled piece of paper with Jim's lyrics to break on through. Day destroys the night, night divides the day. Tried to run, tried to hide, break on through to the other side. Not only were the lines rhythmic, which I as a drummer appreciated, but he was talking about a connection to the void, a raising of consciousness. The words were pulsing with the feeling of a seeker, someone trying to tell us that life is bitter and sweet, but that there is something else. When we first met, the term shaman wasn't in the cultural lexicon yet. Even though I hadn't heard of it, I had read about it in Jim's poems. He was well aware of the techniques of the spiritual leaders in so-called primitive tribes, how they would take psychedelic plants, get into a trance, and heal people. Jim had been a literary scholar for many years, soaking up books and poetry like a sponge. He had started writing at age 14 and had volumes and volumes of journals chock full of his writings, poems, rants, prose. Stories spilled out of his notebooks. In later interviews, he said that his life felt like a bow being pulled back for 22 years and then let go. Jim wasn't a musician per se. In fact, he couldn't play a single chord on any instrument. But as he once told me, when he heard an entire rock concert in his head and wanted to get all that sound out into the world, he thought of melodies to help him remember the lyrics, which were sheer poetry to me. What a gift. If you listen to Crystal Ship, for example, you'll hear the melody crossing some very sophisticated chord changes. Although Jim loved the blues, which have a simple 12-bar form, he also hung on to his inner melodies, which had more complex chord structures. Everything going on in his head was totally intuitive, and without the three of us musicians, he'd have had no form to attach to it. He could write the quintessential Roadhouse Blues and then the much more complicated When the Music's Over and still keep going. The music was never over for Jim. Someone remarked to me that if Jim hadn't found the band, he might have died sooner. I'm still chewing on that thought. The positive side of Jim's excesses, his impulse to have everything and have it now, channeled his angst into creativity. The negative side of it, of course, would eventually surface as substance abuse. The late great Tom Petty, the superb song craftsman, told me a theory of his when we were talking about Jim. Some artists, the very, very great ones, come along with the flame turned all the way up. And the flame is all the way up and you use a lot of fuel fast. And you've got to just get the heat that comes off it. Morrison was full of creativity that had to get out one way or another. The spirit in the bottle eventually doused that flame. But all of us were blessed with his creative spirit for 27 years. That he roamed the planet and gave us that gift of sound. And the sound that came out of Jim's mouth was so special. At first, nerves made his voice thin, but eventually, after about a year of rehearsals, it developed into a deep baritone. Then there was his scream. It sounded like someone being killed, a moan from the bowels of his soul. For a guy who had never sung before he met his bandmates, his voice was a huge gift. While his fellow rock singers began to have throat problems and some had to undergo surgery, Jim never seemed to hurt his pipes, even though he sometimes sounded like he had reached down into his throat and ripped it out to show the world. I guess he naturally sang from his diaphragm, which is the proper way taught by vocal coaches. His 3 musical sidekicks, and it took 3 of us to match the energy of this one person, were lucky and talented enough to figure out the perfect sound bed for Jim to lie down in. When he first sang the end a cappella, it struck me as a goodbye love tune. But over time, as we played it in the clubs, the middle section stretched into a king-size bed for Jim to revel in. You could just feel the love and comfort he got from surrendering to the drone-like guitar, the sustained organ, and the trance groove of the song. My intuition told me to take off the snares, a typical rock sound, and play the dark and moody sound of the tom-toms instead. Jim felt safe enough, cozy in that sonic bed to free up his subconscious mind and let out deep, dark, poetic musings. He unearthed the primal, sexual, Oedipal underpinnings of all of our psyches. The blue bus is calling us. Driver, where you taking us? Meet me at the back of the blue bus. Doing the blue rock on a blue bus. Yeah. Even though I didn't understand some of Jim's lyrics, I didn't question them. I felt them, and they felt right. My friend Robert Bly, the American poet, once said to me that sometimes he'd write a line in one of his poems that he didn't quite understand, but felt needed to be there. Wrapped in a sheet of sound, Jim exposed the archetypical undercurrents threading us all together that we normally aren't aware of. But sometimes, Jim didn't seem to analyze his poetry and just let it rip. Ride the snake to the lake, the ancient lake. The snake he's long, 7 miles, he's old, and his skin is cold, baby. We all took a chance with Jim, meeting him at the back of the blue bus, doing a blue rock, and we are forever grateful. The sound coming from the back of that bus was deep. Primal fears, primal lusts, and everything in between. When I realized Jim was on a fast ascent, I pulled back as a friend, for self-protection. Granted, as soon as we leave the cradle, we're all headed to the grave, but I knew my own descent would be more gradual. I thought what we were doing might last a decade or so, but I had no idea our lead singer was tapping into a core of universal sound vibrations, sonic waves that would last for 50 years, that continue to resonate to this day. Winston Marsalis, who wrote Blood on the Fields, the first jazz composition to win the Pulitzer Prize, describes music as an invisible force. I'm proud and grateful to have been part of that sound with the Doors. Fueled by Jim's drive, we helped him get that concert out of his skull and into the universe. I know that Light My Fire was played on the Apollo 17 mission in 1972, and recently, our first album was put in the Library of Congress, so the Morrison message did get out. I'm sure Jim is very happy about that." End quote. As discussed at the beginning of this video, the Doors wasn't just Jim Morrison, but 4 musicians. Key among them was Ray Manzarek. The following is also from John Densmore's book, The Seekers, where John talks about Ray's importance to the band and their personal relationship through the hard times. Quote, "Organ wizard Ray Manzarek. You see, Ray came with 2 musicians inside his one frame. Let's go back to the beginning. After meeting Ray at the Maharishi meditation class in 1965, I ventured down to his parents' Manhattan Beach house to attend a jam session. I drove up the alley where I heard rock and roll coming from the garage. Ray came out of the front house, walking down the narrow passageway between these beach cottages. He wore a blue long-sleeve dress shirt with the sleeves rolled up and the top unbuttoned halfway. His white pants were also rolled up to reveal flip-flops on his feet. In one of the buttonholes on his shirt, he had placed a daisy. Ray broke into the warmest smile as he directed me where to park. He certainly looked more relaxed than at the meditation class the previous night. That had been a follow-up meeting after we were all initiated, and Ray was complaining about not getting the instant bliss that was promised, he thought, by Jerry Jarvis, the instructor. I knew meditation wasn't going to have effects instantly, so I was willing to try it for a while and see how it went. In any case, Ray and I broke the ice when we started talking about our mutual love of jazz. I told him that I had seen all the greats of the manhole in Hollywood. Miles, Coltrane, Art Blakey, Cannonball Adderley, Bill Evans, and so on. "Bill Evans?" Ray exclaimed. He was jealous. "His genius was in the touch," I waxed. "Yeah," Ray agreed, adding, "Miles got crap for having this mellow white guy in the band, but he knew how good he was." "Yeah, man, Miles doesn't take crap from anybody." "Do you know all blues?" I prompted. "Let's do it," Ray said enthusiastically. Now we would break the ice musically. The tune is in 3/4 time, a waltz tempo that is a good test of whether a musician can swing. Ray and I locked immediately. It felt good. A major component of jazz is improvisation, which forces you to stay in the moment because you never know what will be coming up. There's a lot of freedom and space available as you improvise around the chord changes. In jazz improv or in guitar rock solos, mere speed doesn't guarantee the most creative solo, thank goodness. It's a balance between sound and space, between lyricism and virtuosity. It's about breathing in and breathing out. Sometimes it's cool to show your stuff, demonstrating how fast you can play. But when it comes organically out of an entire solo, it's better. Kind of like being human. Sometimes we have to run, sometimes we get to chill. You can read about what happened after that jam session in all the other Doors books. The extremely important thing to know is that Ray was the first to see the magic in Jim Morrison. He even received flack from some of his fellow UCLA film students for hanging out with Jim. They thought Jim was too crazy. The first set of lyrics Ray gave me, I think intentionally, was for Break On Through to the Other Side. He had immediately resonated with Jim's connection to the world behind this world, or, to quote Michael Mead again, the world where this world came from, just as I did. Another extremely important musical moment happened a month later. We had been auditioning bass players and didn't seem to be getting anywhere. Ray said that he'd seen a Fender electric keyboard bass he wanted to try. I went with him to Glenn Waylich's Music City in Hollywood to check it out. After parking, we passed the display window of the musical instrument department, and there it was, sitting on top of a stand. It looked like a couple of octaves, 24 black and white keys with a silver chrome top. Let's go through the record department quickly, I said, because if we look at everything, we'll never get to the instrument department. Ray knew what I meant. Years before, I got stuck listening for hours in the record booths. What a great store. You could actually play something before you bought it. Started by Glenn Waylich's and songsmith Johnny Mercer, Music City was mecca for all Southern California music junkies. I drooled all over Coltrane's LPs in that booth, I said, as we passed the brown mahogany listening section and entered the musical instruments department. Ray asked if he could play the keyboard bass, and the rep plugged it into an amp. Ray began doing those repetitive lines he was experimenting with on our new songs. I'm thinking of playing this with my left hand and the organ with my right. It sounds like it has enough punch, I said. We didn't want the bass to sound so mushy, which would have been a trap without a separate bass player plucking a string. Remember, this was before the advent of synthesizers and computers, which eventually could duplicate almost any sound in the world. The keyboard bass was a few $100, significant money then, but we bought it. This was a pivotal moment in the formation of our sound. It forced Ray to play the keys more sparsely, with his right hand only, and it also made him simplify his left-hand bass lines. So now in rehearsals, I concentrated on connecting with Ray's left hand. Bass players and drummers are like brothers, working in the basement cooking up the groove. If they don't lock together with the feel, the ensemble will suck. You can have a brilliant drummer and bass player and a lousy guitarist and the band will survive. But if the rhythm section, bass and drums, is lousy, it won't fly, no matter how brilliant the guitarist is. You see, for drummers, one beat is extremely long. The space between one beat and the next is extremely important, since the space implies the feel of the entire composition. If you play on the front of the beat, as in military music, Irish music, polkas, etc., the style I learned in high school, the feel is rather controlled. I used this style way back when I played bar mitzvahs. On the other hand, if you perform with the accent on the back of the beat, if you don't hit the next beat until the last second, the feel is very laid back as in the blues, R&B, ballads, etc. I certainly got this style down playing in bars for years. When the Doors got started, we covered the blues a lot until we had enough originals, so our foundation was first built on a laid-back feel. If you wait until the last millisecond to come in with the second beat, you're playing the blues, leaving as much room as possible for the sadness to enter. Then the originals, with Jim's percussive lyrics. Push the pulse forward a little. Thank goodness Ray and I were in the same arena when we wrote the music to those words. Simply put, if Ray and I had not felt the pulse for Jim's lyrics the same way, there would have been no Doors. I don't mean to be self-congratulatory here. What I do mean to stress is that the rhythm section is the foundation of any ensemble, whether it's a quartet or a 40-piece orchestra. And without a strong foundation, the structure will crumble. It eventually turned out that with Ray and me as that foundation, Robbie could build the walls for Jim to sit on top of as the roof, or up front as the lead singer. The walls were formidable because of Robbie's gifted songwriting skills. If there is mutual respect, the structure will have balance and be very solid, so I credit the pairing of Ray's left hand and my drumming as a blessing from the muse. Now, let's talk about Ray splitting his brain into two. He simultaneously had to lock into a repetitive bass pulse with his left hand and support Jim's lyrics playing chord changes with his right. To do this, he said he thought of playing boogie-woogie bass lines that he learned as a kid in Chicago. If that wasn't enough, he occasionally came up with the most memorable keyboard hooks, music segues in popular music. For example, think of the intro to Light My Fire. It's a circle of fifths played in a Baroque Bach-like style. This keyboard part is permanently stamped on everyone's brain. We will never forget it. Or, take what he created in Riders on the Storm, the mysterious sound supporting Jim's dark lyrics. It was an incredible extended piano solo that I wrote with him up and down the full arc of human emotions. From pianissimo to fortissimo and eventually everything in between, that solo of Ray's will also be stamped on all our brains forever. You only need to hear a couple of bars of music from a great artist and you can identify who it is. Elvin Jones, Ravi Shankar, Janis Joplin, Bob Marley, Van and Jim Morrison. You hear Ray's hand on a Vox organ and you know who it is in 3 seconds. Maybe it's sadness over losing Ray. My early father figure had crossed over. But these days, I aspire to having an even better relationship with my old keyboard player than before. I make a joke about this over and over concerning my deceased mother, but maybe it's not really a joke. An even bigger space can open up in the wake of a significant person's departure. My mind tends to go to my mother and to Ray more often now, because I know that I can't reach them on a physical level. For instance, having dinner in a French restaurant, I flip my fork over like Europeans do and immediately think of Ray. He and his wife Dorothy always ate that way, looking like sophisticated continental diners. As a 20-year-old, I was intimidated by their sophistication. I felt clumsy with my less refined manners. My self-esteem did get a lift, however, when we toured France. My simplified French served me well, while Ray and Dorothy retreated into silence. When I was young, I aspired to be like the extremely cultured ivory tinkler in our band, and I'm still working on it. Back then, Ray was exceptionally well-read, and now I'm catching up. He is still my teacher, now more than ever. I recently had some medical issues around my abdomen, burst appendix, the same area of the body that took Ray out. My compassion for him has increased twofold now that my own experience has made me more aware of how he must have suffered. Okay, I'm sure some of you readers right now are thinking, it's sweet that John is talking to the dead Ray, but let's get real. There's no actual communication once people you knew break on through to the other side. All I can say is, it's more than just mental candy, this expectation that I'm going to jam again with Ray and that big band in the sky. Musicians are serious when they talk about all the incredible musicians now playing in God's orchestra. There's a very deep bond between melody makers. Check out Ray's solo record, Golden Scarab, to see clearly into his metaphysical side. Now I sound like my devout Catholic mother, who is going to see all her friends in heaven. It's a mystery to me, a great mystery, with a capital M. Maybe that's why Ray had a giant Art Deco poster with a big M in the middle. Of course, the M stood for Manzarek, which implies he had a large ego. When I challenged Ray in my first memoir that he might be working the Willy Loman beat a little too hard, The Selling of the Doors, he got back at me in his own book by saying that Jim had hated me as a human being. Jim might very well have said that, probably while tripping, and maybe because I didn't do as many drugs as he did. But you see, Jim and I are okay with that now. I sacrificed over 5 years of my life trying to preserve Jim's legacy through a brutal court battle. It's amusing, or rather prophetic, how in Riders, I used what I thought was just a technique to communicate with Jim, writing him a continuing letter in the first person as if he could hear me even though he had passed. Now, I feel the love energy not only with Jim, but with Ray too. Toward the end of our career, a philosophical gap grew between Ray and me. You can read all about it in The Doors Unhinged. But here it suffices to say that I was so angry at him, I felt it would take several incarnations to forgive him. Now, writing Unhinged helped. As I wrote the last chapter of that book, how could I not love Ray? We had created magic together in a garage so many years ago. I sent that last chapter to Ray and Robbie before the book was published, to make sure they got to that section, because the first half was going to be a tough pill for them to swallow. But even among those philosophical and personal struggles, the two of us never lost the almost telepathic communication we had on the musical level. He was comfortable, as I was, with venturing outside traditional rhythmic and chord structures, but he also knew that eventually you had to get back or you would leave the cosmos and your audience behind. When to come back is the question, and that is one that can only be answered intuitively. Ray and I were completely in sync when it came to finding common musical ground. The musical ground each of us brought to our partnership fed us well and fertilized our unique sound and feel. With my drums and Ray's left hand as the bottom, Robbie Krieger's liquid guitar completed the sound. The resulting melting pot was an American gumbo that Jim obviously couldn't get enough of. I say that not out of arrogance. Just think about it. Here was a guy who had never sung before and who, after getting over his shyness, sang from the bowels of his vocal cords. He was in heaven, lying on the bed of sound we made for him. Without Manzarek, our quartet would have sounded like a three-legged dog. When I heard that Ray was getting really sick, I gave him a call. Our relationship had obviously been strained, so I was very pleased that he picked up the phone. We talked about his bout with cancer, and I said to give his wife Dorothy my love. At the time, I didn't know it was going to be my last conversation with him. I'm so grateful that we had a closing talk. I will forever miss this remarkable, gifted musician. After Ray passed, I called Robbie, told him death trumps everything, suggested we get together. It felt so good. After only a few bars, we were back in the garage in Venice, California.